Hey y'all, I wanted to bring something a little bit different this time. I know the common thing for these type of channels now is to just combine like 10 hours worth of one series, say for example, the Mega series. I know some of you have requested that I do that too, but I've decided to do something a little bit different. Instead, I wanted to put together a compilation of the best mysteries we have covered since I started the channel. I choose to take this route for a couple of reasons. For one, the 10-hour compilation of videos from one series is just kinda lazy. I mean, I have a playlist set up for those videos that I know you all use, so really, what would be the point in making a 10-hour video that's just that playlist? Secondly, the audio in my earlier videos was really bad, so this gives me the opportunity to re-record some of my favorite earlier segments and present them here. I guess you could say, remastered. However, I will not be touching up the video portion of these old videos, so please overlook that, and remember, that's when I first started. I tried to choose a wide variety of mysteries, taken from all the series of the first year of the channel. Finally, I have to say thanks to the members who have so kindly supported the channel and have been supportive of me as I take a small break. Speaking of memberships, this first strange mystery is a members exclusive video, and yes, that is a cheap plug for the channel memberships. On June 11th, 2006, 56-year-old librarian Mary Cooper and her 27-year-old daughter, teacher Susanna Stodden, set out for a day of hiking. The two women loved to spend time in nature, whether it be for a hike alone or a hike together, and the two had planned to hike Mount Pilchuck that morning in Snohomish County, Washington, but for some unknown reason, they changed their minds and instead headed to nearby Pinnacle Lake, possibly because it had snowed. Regardless, the Pinnacle Lake Trail is described as being a 4-mile hike and listed as a moderate challenge. The road to the trailhead is also difficult. It's a 6-mile gravel road with deep potholes, but Mary and Susanna would drive on up and park their vehicle and then walk to the trailhead. They would briefly chat with a couple who went on ahead of them, and then Mary and Susanna would depart around 10 a.m. Mary's husband and Susanna's father, David, was a contractor working on a house near Green Lake, some 60 miles away. When he got home that evening around 5:30 p.m., he was surprised to see that Mary still had not arrived home, since she had left so early to hit the trail. David, who was active as well, had plans that evening to train for a big bicycling trip he had coming up, so he met with his friend and took off riding, assuming that Mary would be home by the time he got back, or at the very least, that she would have contacted him. But when David got back from his bike ride, Mary wasn't there, and he still had not heard from her. Now, he was starting to panic. Neither his wife nor daughter Susanna were answering their phone, so he called the police to report them missing. And by 10 p.m., he was so worried he was about to head out to Mount Pilchuck by himself, because that was the last plans he had heard from them, and he did not know that they had changed their mind and went to Pinnacle Lake. However, he found this out pretty quickly, because detectives called him back to break the bad news. His wife Mary and daughter Susanna had been killed, and I don't know for sure what they told David here at first, because initial media reports said that it was a possible animal attack. However, the official report soon made its way to the media. They had both died from a small caliber gunshot wound to the head, and no attempt had been made to hide their bodies, just leaving them out on the trail. And while no sexual assault occurred, some sources have stated that some of the women's clothes were removed. The investigation started, and there wasn't really much to go on. For one, nobody even knew the women had changed their mind and picked a different trail. Regardless, David was interrogated the most since he was the husband, yet he was supposed to be 60 miles away. They then turned to other hikers. However, because of the location of this trail and the long potholed gravel road, it's not hiked as much, and there were a few people there that day. Of these was the couple that Mary and Susanna had chatted with that morning. They would report that they thought they had heard thunder, but no one else on the trail reported to have heard anything remotely close to a gunshot. The bodies were found about 2:30 p.m., and they were discovered by another hiker who then called 911. What's really odd about this one is the location. They had been killed about 2 miles into the trail, and on that trail, there was only one way up and one way down. it didn't fork or anything like that, which means that the person killed the two women and then hiked carefully back 2 miles, potentially past other hikers, all the way down to their car, where they would then have to slowly travel down this 6-mile pothole-filled gravel road, where the road is so small you have to pull over to let the other person by, meaning it's very slow and you get a good look at the other driver. Whoever done this took a lot of risk, but it has been proposed that maybe this person somehow escaped into the woods, but it's thought that's very unlikely. Others have speculated that they could have ran into someone at the gas station who then followed them up to the trail, but to me, this one seems just as unlikely. There's also the fact that their backpacks were untouched, so robbery wasn't the motive. Actually, the real motive is far scarier. Detectives believe whoever done this had went to the trail ahead of time and just waited, with the sole intent of wanting to kill someone. The couple who had met Mary and Susanna at the trailhead are the last people to see them alive. As mentioned, the four had talked a bit at the trailhead, and the couple actually departed out ahead of them, and they reported to have not seen anyone, nor had they seen any illegal activity, like a drug deal, which is speculated that Mary and Susanna walked up on. And it's added to the mystery as to why the killer let this couple pass and then wait for the two women. For David's part, he has become incredibly frustrated at law enforcement, who he feels has not done a good job with the investigation, stalling it at the beginning by grilling him when he was an hour and a half away. Although he stated he knew he would have to be cleared first, it just took too long. He was only officially cleared 12 years later in 2018, after taking his third polygraph. Apparently, the first two he had taken came back as inconclusive. In defense of the sheriff's department, random murders are the hardest to solve, especially ones out in the open. Murders inside a room are contained, but on a hiking trail, on a mountain, well, that increases the difficulty dramatically. The only suspect ever publicly mentioned was that of Israel Keys, the boogeyman for every unsolved murder from 1998 to 2012. He was actually in Washington at the time, but he was a good 4 to 5 hours away, and although conceivable, it's very unlikely, leaving the FBI to basically rule him out. It's been almost 2 decades, and the murders are still unsolved. Between September 18th and October 12th, 2001, someone would mail anthrax spores to several people in the U.S., mainly consisting of senators and media figure targets. In total, 5 people would end up dead, with 17 others infected. Starting just a week after September 11th, the nation was already on edge. A scared public immediately suspected that it must be Al-Qaeda. In fact, documents would reveal later on that the White House pressured the FBI to find the evidence that it was bin Laden. However, the idea of that was soon dropped, as it was too sophisticated for Al-Qaeda. Early suspicion that would turn up being unfounded was bioweapons expert Stephen Hatfield. He would later sue and win $5 million from the FBI for the trouble of being wrongly suspected. By April 2005, though, Bruce Edwards Ivins would become the first real viable suspect. Ivins was a scientist at a biodefense lab in Frederick, Maryland, and after 2 years of building a case, the FBI would put Ivins under periodic surveillance. Within 3 months, Ivins would commit suicide, taking any secrets with him. Fast forward a year, and in August 2008, federal prosecutors would name Ivins the culprit based on DNA evidence coming from an anthrax vial in his lab. By February 19, 2010, the FBI would formally close its investigation. However, in 2011, the National Academy of Sciences would release a report that cast a doubt on the FBI's conclusion that the anthrax came from Ivins' laboratory. The FBI would then counter this claim by stating that their investigation was not based on science alone and that they couldn't divulge some of the evidence, such as Ivins' mental health, which is still sealed to this day. What is known is Ivins had told previous therapists of his plans to murder numerous people over several years, ranging from a girl he was interested in to the therapists themselves. It was also reported he threatened other scientists, made statements about his involvement in the crime, as well as blaming others for the mailings. However, there are reasons for doubts. For one, Ivins was only one of 100 people that had access to these files. and the FBI could never place him near the New Jersey mailbox that the anthrax was mailed from. They were also unable to find any spores in Ivan's house, vehicle, or his belongings. And even though he had made several threatening statements over the years, Ivan's memorial service would be attended by over 200 people. And to add to the doubt, the bacteriology division at the Army laboratory said it lacked the facilities to make the spores that were sent out in those letters in 2001, and the federal government conceded to that fact. However, the FBI and Justice Department still believe it was Ivan's. People are split on just who done it. Some theories state that Syria or Iraq directed the attacks, or that the US government knew in advance and allowed it to happen, or just straight up FBI incompetence. Others still think it was Ivan's, or that it was Ivan's working with others. Known as the Mary Celeste of the Pacific, the MV Joyita was a merchant vessel operating in the South Pacific in 1955. On the morning of October 3rd at 5 a.m., Captain Thomas Miller, a British sailor living in Samoa, would get up to start the departure. Miller used the ship as a trading and fishing charter boat, in what would be already a foreboding sign. The departure had been pushed back until that early morning, as the day before, Miller would discover a port engine clutch failure. After not being able to fix the engine, Miller decided to go on and take the Joyita with one engine. She was carrying 16 crew members and 9 passengers. One of these, a surgeon, on his way to do an amputation. The cargo on board consisted of medical supplies, timber, empty oil drums, and various food. The voyage was expected to take between 41 and 48 hours, and was scheduled to make landfall on October 5th. However, by October 6th, a message from Vakafo Port sent out word that the ship was overdue. A search and rescue mission would be launched immediately, and they combed the ocean from October 6th to October 12th. 6 full days and nearly 100,000 square miles of ocean later, the crew would call off the search, as they had not came across one sign of the ship or anyone on board. As distressing as it was to not have been able to find one clue about the ship's disappearance, things were only made more confusing by the fact that there had been no distress signal sent out. Captain Miller was experienced, and it was baffling that he had not made a call. Investigators would, however, get some answers 5 weeks later, when Captain Gerald Douglas of the merchant ship Tuvalu would sight Joyita more than 600 miles west of her route, drifting north of Vanilla Lavu. The ship was partially submerged. The men saw no sight of passengers or crew. Once reported, a recovery party would go investigate. They found barnacle growth above the waterline, indicating that Joyita had been partially submerged for some time. There was some damage to the vessel as well. The bridge had been smashed away. The deck house had light damage and broken windows. The starboard engine was found to be covered by mattresses, while the port engine's clutch was still partially disassembled, showing that the vessel was still being pushed along by one engine. An auxiliary pump had been rigged to the engine room, mounted on a plank of wood between the two engines. However, it had not been connected. Checking the radio, investigators would see that it was tuned to the International Distress Channel, indicating that someone had at least tried to call out, but upon further inspection, it was discovered that there was a break in the cable, and that it had been painted over at some point, obscuring the break. This limited the range of the radio to 2 miles. Inspectors also took note that the navigation lights were on, and that all the electric clocks had stopped at 10:25 p.m., indicating whatever had happened must have occurred at night. Strangely, the ship's logbook, sextant, mechanical chronometer, and other navigational equipment were all missing, as well as the firearms. To further add to the mystery, the doctor's bag was found on deck containing a stethoscope, a scalpel, and bloodstained bandages. There was still fuel in the tanks of the vessel too. The amount used was around 243 miles before it was abandoned, just within 50 miles of their destination. Finally, it was noted that the dinghy and the 3 life rafts were all missing, and of special note, the Joyita did not carry enough life jackets for all the members of the vessel. The investigators would take Joyita back to the harbor to investigate further, and they found that although the lower decks had been flooded, her hull was still in great condition, and it was found that a fractured cooling pipe of the engine's coolant system had failed due to corrosion, allowing water in. By the time the crew would have discovered the water, it would have been too late to locate the leak. But what makes this case really strange and unique is the abandonment of a ship that was not going to sink. The cork-lined hull made it almost impossible. Captain Miller would have known this too, and it's almost inconceivable that he would have ordered the abandonment of it. An inquiry would, however, put most of the blame on Captain Miller, as the ship was in such bad need of repairs. Things like going out with one engine, numerous other minor faults, not having a working radio, not properly equipping the lifeboats. Miller would be branded as a reckless captain. With that being said, it's still a mystery as to what happened to them. Why did they leave the safety of the Joyita when it was not in any danger of sinking? Well, there are a few theories. As mentioned before, Captain Miller was well aware of the vessel's ability to be almost unsinkable, leading many to believe that he had either died or become incapacitated in some measure. Evidence of this could be found in the bloody bandages. Without him to calm the crew and passengers, they could have panicked and fled to the lifeboats, either taking an unconscious Miller with them or leaving him behind if he had died. But this doesn't explain the missing cargo and equipment. As further proof of this claim, a friend of Miller, Captain S.B. Brown, would state that Miller would have never left the Joyita because he knew of the cork-lined hull. Brown would also go on to state, though, that there was tension between Miller and first mate Chuck Simpson. In fact, the men hated each other. Captain Brown speculated that the two could have came to blows, and then either both of them falling overboard or becoming severely injured. The remaining people would have panicked and fled the flooded vessel. Another theory was, since this was post-World War II, anti-Japanese sentiment was spread throughout the Pacific, so it's not too strange that they would end up being accused. Numerous papers from around the world would claim that the Japanese had kidnapped the occupants of the Joyita. The Fiji Times would even claim a source told them that the Joyita had passed through a fleet of Japanese shipping boats during its trip and observed something that it shouldn't have seen, leaving the Japanese with no choice but to take them. However, little proof of this came up, but not to be outdone, the Soviets would also be among the rumored kidnappers, capturing them via a submarine. Hey, it was the Cold War. One of the more weaker theories was the insurance fraud angle. Miller had amassed a large series of debts with his unsuccessful fishing trips, and it was speculated he intentionally tried to sink Joyita with its passengers and crew. This would have been way more difficult to pull off. Not to mention, Miller was also running government charters between Samoa and Tokelau, which would have paid off his debts pretty quickly. The final theory is mutiny. It states that the flooding, caused by the broken coolant pipe and failure of the pumps, would set off a flurry of events. The mattresses found covered on the starboard engine were used either in an attempt to stop a leak or to protect the electrical switchboard from the sprays of water. At the same time, the Joyita was entering increasingly hostile weather. Miller, knowing that the Joyita was basically unsinkable, would press on. He did have debts that needed paid, and in his mind, there was no danger. However, Simpson and the rest of the crew would demand he turn back, and although it's not known for sure, this theory states that Miller was either tied down, injured, or killed. Simpson would try to turn back, but the engine failed, stranding them in the ocean. Simpson would then order everyone to abandon ship, taking the equipment, logbook, and supplies, and possibly Miller himself. But Simpson was first mate, and it seems unlikely that he would choose to abandon the ship either. But there was also the possibility that Simpson saw a nearby reef or island and tried to make it there, only to be blown off course and lost at sea. On August 1st, 1989, Ronnie Jack of Prince George, British Columbia, would go to the First Leader pub, only 4 blocks away from his home. Ronnie had been out of work a bit due to a back injury he suffered at a sawmill, which resulted in him and his family living on welfare for a while. But that night at the pub, someone would offer to help Jack. A man would come in, and the two would start to chat. This man would tell Ronnie about a job opportunity for him and his wife at a logging camp in the Clocos Lake area, about 25 miles west of Prince George. The man told Ronnie he could go to work bucking logs, and his wife Doreen could be a cook helper in the camp kitchen, and that there was a daycare that Ronnie could leave his 2 children, Russell and Ryan, with. Ronnie accepted the job as they were in bad need, but the Jacks did not have a car. But it was no worry, because the man offered to drive them to the job site that night. But first, the Jacks would have to go home to pack. Luckily, one of the Jacks' cousins came by to help them, and at 11:16 p.m., Ronnie would call his brother and tell him about the camp job. 2 hours after that, he would call his parents at Burns Lake, British Columbia, to let them know he would be gone for 10 to 14 days working at the logging camp, and he would return in time to get the kids ready for school starting in September. By 1:21 a.m., all 4 members of the Jack family would be seen leaving their home and piling into the man's 4-wheel drive, a dark-colored pickup truck. A few weeks would go by with no one hearing from the family. 22 days later, on August 24th, they would finally be reported missing. Police would search, but could not find the family. Neither could they find the man or truck. And as for the logging camp, investigators would call several logging companies, only to find out there was no camps hiring in the area at that time. In fact, not one clue about the family would surface for nearly 7 years, when on January 28, 1996, on an early Sunday morning, Vanderhoof police would get a call, a quick and muffled phone call. The man would state, quote, "The Jack family are buried in the south end of blank ranch," end quote, before hanging up. The call lasted only about 10 seconds, and it was so muffled that police aren't sure what ranch was mentioned. And the call was so quick, the dispatcher didn't even get to ask questions. Police were eventually able to trace the call back to a house in the Stony Creek area, where a house party had taken place during the time frame of the call, which explains why it was so hard to hear what the caller was saying. RCMP interviewed all the partygoers, but discovered no new leads, and were never able to identify the person that made the call. Police would eventually take those calls to the University of British Columbia for further analysis. The university was able to clean up some of the muffled noise, and although police still were not sure, they thought the tipster may have said Gordy's Ranch, or possibly even Cordy's or Corey's. So after further investigation, the RCMP would go search for what they thought was the right Gordy's Ranch. However, they didn't find any trace of the missing family. Since this investigation started, the RCMP have conducted hundreds of interviews, obtained thousands of documents, and searched several properties. The most recent search taking place in 2019 at a property in South Vanderhoof at an indigenous reserve. They have also received numerous anonymous tips, some in which the police speculate is coming from the same person. In particular, as recent as 2018, a person both called and sent an anonymous letter to a third party. Police have not disclosed what was in the letter, but said the information was useful, and they asked for this individual to reach out to them again. But with all these tips, there is no one arrested, no suspects, no persons of interest. So this all leads back to 2 questions. Just who was the man that Ronnie met at the First Leader pub that night, and what happened after they left the Jack residence? Statements from 2 witnesses that night, one, who was the cousin, would offer a description of the man. He was described as being a white male, 6 foot to 6.5 foot tall, with reddish-brown hair, a short full beard, and mustache. His hair went to the bottom of his ears and was parted on one side, between 35 to 40 years old, approximately 200 to 275 pounds. He was described as being hefty, but not fat. He wore a baseball cap, a red checkered work shirt, faded blue jeans, waist-length blue nylon jacket, and work boots with leather fringes over the toes. Police would use this information to make 2 sketches of the man. And as far as what happened after they left, one early theory was that they simply ran off the road and have never been found. It is true that this area has some harsh terrain with cliffs, waterways, wilderness, and rough roads with unannounced drop-offs. Still, this doesn't explain why the man's employer or family did not contact the RCMP about his disappearance. Furthermore, was the fact that the police could never find this alleged logging camp that was hiring in Klucos. But one thing that has been noted about this whole case, if a logging camp was logging illegally in an area, it is most likely they would not confirm that they had hired Ronnie, and if the man had crashed with Ronnie and his whole family, as some have theorized, then that could be why the loggers never reported him missing, and it could also explain why the RCMP was not able to find a logging camp, as the loggers would have packed up and left quickly, although it still leaves one to wonder why the man's family didn't report him missing. Another theory that would be looked at was Ronnie was possibly involved in some illegal activity and was looking to go away and start over with new identities, and that man at the pub was simply being paid to help move them somewhere and start over. The problem with this was Ronnie didn't have a lot of money, certainly not enough to pay someone for a new identity, plus move him and his family somewhere else to start over. However, there are some things to consider that possibly point towards something like this. For instance, how many people would have a short talk with a stranger at a rundown pub before going home, packing up, taking their wife and kids, and getting into a vehicle with a stranger and letting him take you wherever, especially at 1 a.m. It doesn't make sense. It gives off the indication that the Jack family was in a hurry. Of course, the counter-argument could be that they were just desperate for money. A third theory is the possible murder/suicide by Ronnie Jack. This theory is the least likely, but it's been discussed by some online sleuths. It basically comes from two things. One, according to Doreen's sister, Ronnie was abusive to Doreen. The second thing is the cousin that came and helped them pack. Why did this cousin randomly show up between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. to help them pack? It seems odd that he would just drop by that late, unless the family called him, but the cousin did not state that. Furthermore, the police would call his description that the cousin gave of the man sketchy. Finally, the most disturbing and probably valid theory, as police have pretty much said that this is what they believe happened. A desperate Ronnie was duped by an unidentified man. There was no camp or job, and the story was a total ruse. The mystery is, for what purpose and who did it? Well, there are a few possibilities, and none of them are good. The obvious would be to murder them, or maybe he just wanted the wife or kids. No one knows the true motives. It should also be mentioned that this took place not far from the infamous Highway of Tears in Canada that has an extremely long list of missing and murdered people, mainly women and First Nations people. But the Jack family is the only family in Canada's history to completely vanish. That's why no one is 100% sure that they met with foul play. It's extremely rare for a serial killer to try and kill a whole family. It's a lot more difficult too. And as far as who this mysterious individual was, well, RCMP doesn't know. They've never had a person of interest the entire time of the investigation. However, Doreen's sister in 2012 would say that she now believed the serial killer, Bobby Jack Fowler, was behind the family's disappearance. Fowler, who died in prison in 2006, was never considered a suspect in the investigation. However, the RCMP was able to connect him to at least one murder in Prince George, British Columbia in 1974, when he murdered a then 16-year-old Colleen McMillan, who was walking to a friend's house. He is also a strong suspect in two more murders that occurred there in the early 70s. However, he does not fit the description given by the witnesses. Furthermore, is the time frame. The RCMP is not exactly sure where he was in 1989. He was a notorious drifter and traveled extensively across the US and British Columbia. He is a person of interest or suspect in at least 16 cases, but the RCMP believes he may have possibly killed more than 20 plus people. However, so far authorities have not been able to link him to the Jack's disappearance, or anyone else for that matter. At 8:15 p.m. on April 20th, 1989, Peggy Bueller and her father were traveling west on Montana Highway 200 near Circle, Montana, when they spotted a vehicle heading east on the wrong side of the road. Peggy was able to swerve to the shoulder, avoiding the collision. However, the vehicle crashed into a car traveling behind her, which was being driven by police dispatcher Carol Heights. Carol would emerge unharmed and witness a blonde woman emerge from the other car. Carol would state that that woman would just come up to her and stare, never say anything, even after Carol asked her if she was okay. Peggy, who was still sitting on the shoulder, would then see this blonde woman climb over a fence and stand motionless, observing the scene. As she looked out at the accident, she noted this woman stood there like a spectator, like the crash had not even happened to her. That woman would stand silent for several moments on the other side of the fence in the empty field, before finally turning around and walking off into the darkness. Peggy would immediately drive to town to find a phone, while her father remained with Carol at the accident. When police arrived, the unknown woman was still missing. Law enforcement would run her plate number, and they would discover that woman was named Patricia Meehan. Police would start a search for her. They discovered a trail of tennis shoe tracks beginning in a desolate field about 3/4 of a mile from the crash. They believed it to be Patricia's. They would follow those tracks until 3 a.m. before they disappeared in the terrain. The search would be suspended until the following morning. Her parents would fly in shortly after this and start distributing missing person posters. Volunteers would help search the mountains near the crash with ATVs and horses. A helicopter also searched the area, yet not one sign of her was found. Adding confusion was the question, why was Patricia in the town of Circle anyways? That town was nearly 400 miles away from her home in Bozeman. Her family had no idea why, and police could not find anyone that knew either. Police would start to theorize that she had fled the scene by hitchhiking. They also thought she may have stowed away on a hay truck that had been parked a half a mile up the road, but they were not able to substantiate these claims. Patricia's mother would state that she had been experiencing depression at the time and actually had a psychologist visit scheduled the day after the crash. The case would get stranger yet. In the coming days, police would receive several reported sightings of Patricia, and they were very credible. The first would be on May 4th, just 2 weeks after the crash, when a police officer in Laverne, Minnesota, which is about 10 hours from the crash, would claim he was in Hardee's when he saw Patricia. It was noted by the employees there that she had sat alone in a booth for 5 hours drinking water. When the store closed, she would make her way over to a nearby 24-hour diner. The police officer would see her again, and this time, he would try asking her name, and the woman would refuse to give it. He then asked her where she was from, and she said Colorado before taking it back and saying Israel. The following day, 2 more sightings were reported, this time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, about 35 minutes from Laverne, at a truck stop diner, drinking coffee from 12 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Later that same day, another waitress at the diner in Murdo, South Dakota, about 3 hours from Sioux Falls, would report seeing Patricia between 10 and 11 p.m. in the company of a man in his 30s. At this point, police were certain she was hitchhiking with truck drivers along I-90. They would also now believe that she was suffering from amnesia after receiving a blow to the head in the accident. The sightings did not stop either. Back near her home in Bozeman, a waitress would report that Patricia came in. She requested to be served quickly, saying she was in a hurry, that she planned to go shopping. This was corroborated by another waitress who was also working there. She would state that Patricia seemed disoriented and really spacey. She was talking to herself and sat at the table for an hour and a half looking out the window, watching people walk by. A few days later in the week, she would be spotted at a horse auction in Billings, a few hours from her home. This was a very credible sighting because Patricia had worked as a ranch hand. She loved animals, in particular horses, and she had worked several odd jobs on ranches to support herself, so being seen at a horse show just added even more believability to an already crazy case. Sightings would continue on into late May and June, this time in Washington State, more than 10 hours away. She would be offered a ride by a truck driver, which she turned down, and then she notified a woman that her car broke down and she needed to get to a phone. She would also ask several passing motorists the way to Aberdeen. In the 2 months, over 25 sightings would be reported, 3 of which police deemed very credible. Other reported sightings at truck stops between Montana and Seattle would continue. It's thought at this point that Patricia may have started regaining some of her memories, as her sister lived in Seattle and her ex-boyfriend lived in Spokane. Her mother and father, Thomas and Dolly, would take posters up and down I-90 to truck stops and diners. At least 60 people told her parents they had seen her. However, they only felt 5 of these were extremely credible. So what happened to Patricia? Theories are divided amongst the following. She walked off into the mountains and committed suicide. Given credence to this one is the speculation that the head-on crash was indeed a suicide attempt, and seeing that she failed, it's thought maybe she was stunned for a few minutes only to walk off and attempt it again somewhere she would not be found. The second theory is the most widely held belief. She escaped the crash and lived on the highways with truckers for a period of time before settling down somewhere on a ranch. The belief is she had gotten amnesia from the crash and was unable to remember her family or herself and started a new life. But if it wasn't amnesia, it could have just been a breaking point in Patricia's life. It was reported by her mother that she was under extreme stress and seemed to be depressed. It's possible that Patricia was contemplating her next move She got into the crash and thought, "That's it, I'm done, I'm starting over somewhere," and then spent the next couple of years moving around until she settled somewhere and started life in a new direction. I know eyewitness testimony is infamously bad. However, she was spotted by 5,000 plus people, not to mention 2 waitresses at the diner next to her home. There's just too much in these sightings to overlook them. Finally, another theory stated that after bouncing around from town to town for a while, Patricia ended up being homeless. The only real proof of this is a few reportings from people claiming to have seen her at a homeless shelter. Her family would also be alerted to this and fly out to see her. Yet when they got there, the shelter told the family they had missed the lady by just a few minutes. On April 8, 1992, Jeff Mayrose of Indianapolis, Indiana, would go into the MAB paint store which he managed. He would be the first witness to see a notorious serial killer that would torment the Midwest for the next 29 days. Stretching over 1,200 miles, the serial killer would end up killing 6 victims and being suspected in at least 3 more, plus 1 attempted. Jeff would first see the man in a green jacket walking down Pendleton Pike. Jeff would note he had looked like a guy that had been sleeping in his clothes. He would go on to say the man was carrying a long bag, which made him assume that he was a hitchhiker. He came from the direction of I-465, which intersects with I-70. The man would stop at Jeff's store, then repeatedly circle around the building before sitting on a curb nearby. Mayrose said the man remained there for half an hour or more, staring at the Payless shoe store across the street while digging through his bag. Jeff would say he was talking to himself and was giggling, stating his belief that the man was on drugs or had mental problems. Jeff would go on to say the man would disappear around 2 p.m., but he would later catch a glimpse of him trying to catch a ride north back towards I-465. Meanwhile, Robin Foldauer was working in the shoe store alone. She was 26 years old and was only working because she was covering someone's shift who had called in sick. It would be around 3 p.m. when her body would be discovered in the back part of a store in the storage room. In the 1-hour period of leaving the paint store, the unknown killer would start his campaign of terror. Authorities were able to figure out she had been murdered execution style. Less than $100 would be stolen from the register, a very small amount for such a horrendous crime. Just 3 days later, at a bridal shop in Wichita, 23-year-old Patricia Smith and 32-year-old Patricia Majors would be murdered. The store normally closed at 6, but they had told a male customer they would stay over so he could pick up his item. The killer would arrive, and the women would think it was the customer, and they allowed him in. He would then kill them, again execution style, and again, only a small amount of money was stolen. This was the only murder where there was more than one victim. At about this time, the actual customer arrived, to which the perp told him to go to the back, but the customer refused, which no doubt saved his life. The killer allowed him to leave the scene. He then drove off and called the police. There are some conflicting reports here, as some reports say the man waited a full hour to report the incident to police because he was scared and still in shock, while other accounts say he immediately went to the police. Regardless, he was able to give a description of the man. He was a slender white man with reddish or sandy blonde hair, stubble beard, thin lips, and lazy eyes. He was 5'6" to 5'9" and 150 pounds, in his 20s or 30s. He was neatly dressed and clean cut. He also described the man as being in a trance or had his mind on something else. He also noted the man was carrying an Uzi-type gun. 2 weeks later, on April 27th, Michael McCown was working in his mother's ceramic store in Indiana when the killer would come in and murder McCown and steal his wallet, which had less than $50 in it. Michael was the only man murdered in this spree. It is theorized the killer only went into the store, called Sylvia Ceramics, because it had a female name, and the killer was expecting a female clerk. It was originally reported that Michael had long hair that he kept in a ponytail, and investigators believed Michael was kneeled down, stocking shoes, when the killer came in and shot him from behind, possibly thinking he was a woman. But in recent interviews with Michael's family, they have claimed this was incorrect, and Michael had short hair at the time of the murder. Another week later, on May 3rd, Nancy Kitzmiller would be found dead at another footwear shop in St. Charles, Missouri, by customers at 2:30 p.m., and it was immediately linked to the killer. A passerby, who was Nancy's last customer, would note that the man was medium height and had dull red hair. The last official murder would take place only 4 days later in Raytown, Missouri, as Sarah Blessing would be murdered in her gift shop. The murder occurred during the day, and this time there were witnesses. At 6:30 p.m., an auctioneer saw a mysterious unidentified man walk in and out of her store suspiciously. The nearby video store clerk would also see the killer enter, hear a pop, and then see the killer leave. The video store clerk would also say the man had hung around the shopping center for a while that day and was mumbling to himself, just like Jeff Morose had reported. A clerk at the nearby grocery store would see the suspect climbing back up the hill to the I-70 highway, and that's where his name comes in. Every murder was right off of I-70, and usually at a strip mall, at slow times of the day. The victims all bore similar characteristics, outside the lone male victim. That being, the victims were usually petite young women with long dark hair, and outside the Wichita murder, all the victims were alone. And since none of the victims were sexually assaulted, detectives speculate he was a thrill killer and was using robbery as a secondary motive. All the victims worked at small shops near the interstate, mostly businesses with just an employee or two, and the murder weapon was also sort of uncommon. It was believed to be an Intratec Scorpion or Irma Work Model ET-22. No suspects have ever been named publicly, but law enforcement believes the man traveled the route either because of his job, such as a traveling salesman, or he may have been a hitchhiker, or he could have been in those areas because he had family there. The latter got more attention once it was realized by investigators that every murder had taken place within the vicinity of a small residential area. Police checked registrations from every hotel along I-70 during the time frame. They also checked toll booths, license plates, traffic stops, and yet never had one solid lead. There are 3 other murders, and one attempted, of store clerks that many investigators believe are linked to him. The first 2 murders would happen in 1993 in Texas, while an attempted murder would happen in 1994, and finally, a 2001 murder that would take place in Indiana. The first murder in 1993 happened on September 25th in Fort Worth at an antique store when 51-year-old Mary Ann Glasscock was killed. Then again, on November 1st in Arlington when 22-year-old Amy Vess would be shot to death in a dance apparel store. The lone surviving victim, assuming it was the I-70 killer, was 35-year-old Vicki Webb, who would be shot in a gift shop in Houston on January 15th, 1994. She briefly talked to the shooter before he shot her in the back of the head. The bullet did not penetrate though, due to a large vertebrae being hit. The killer attempted to shoot her again, but his gun misfired, and he left, assuming Webb was dead. Although the MO was very similar, and the murders took place with a .22, a ballistics test determined that it was not the same gun as the one used in the I-70 killings, leaving investigators with no way to 100% verify that it was the same killer. The last murder that may be connected is the 2001 Terre Haute murder of liquor store clerk Billy Brossman. It happened on the evening of November 30th, 2001, when Billy was working alone. Security camera footage showed a white male suspect enter the store, pull a gun on Brossman, and rob the cash register. The footage then showed the suspect lead Brossman to the back of the store and murder him with a single shot in the back of the head. The murder of Brossman occurred just 7 blocks from the murder of Michael McCown and had a similar MO to the I-70 murders. However, unlike the I-70 murders, there was security footage here, but it would take 20 years for investigators to name the I-70 killer as a possible suspect in the murder. And that's because in November 2021, a task force was launched to capture the I-70 killer. It consisted of the FBI, ATF, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, Terre Haute Police Department, St. Charles Police Department, and Raytown Police Department. And after only a short few months, in April 2022, the task force would announce they collected touch DNA from a bridal veil and the pants pocket of Michael McCown. The case is currently very active, and the hopes are an arrest could come very soon. Everyone knows about Wikipedia. It was formed on January 15th, 2001, and went on to become the largest existing online reference and encyclopedia, and it's famous for allowing anyone to edit it. However, one mystery about Wiki is, who made the first edit? The debate breaks down into 2 camps. One theory states that the earliest edit was on Wiki's founding day when an anonymous editor created the homepage with the text, "This is the new Wikipedia." However, co-founder Jimmy Wales disputes this and claims that he made the first edit on Wiki utilizing the "Hello World" text. Prior to 2019, it was believed the oldest surviving edit on Wiki was actually made one day later, on January 16th, 2001, but in 2019, it would be discovered when looking over an import of user mod Wiki revisions, an edit that was made on the day of Wiki's launch. The homepage was created with the text, "This is the new Wikipedia," and on August 13th, 2019, users would show Jimmy Wales the discovered oldest post on Wiki. He responded that there were earlier edits when he revealed he had deleted several early Wikipedia edits. Then he stated the first official edit was his own "Hello World," and in December 2021, the claim would gain traction when Wales announced he would sell an NFT that recreated the first edit. It would be sold almost 2 weeks later for $750,000. The Hello World edit is permanently lost because it was wiped from the server, leaving no trace. This would, however, challenge the legitimacy of the claim made by Wales. Joseph Regal, a professor and prominent Wiki contributor, requested a source for the Hello World claim, stating that based on the Starling archive, the "This is the new Wikipedia" was indeed the first post, published at 7:27:13 p.m. Regal would note that the website in December 2010 archived the first known 10,000 edits, which again showed "This is the new Wikipedia" was the first edit. Another influential Wikipedian would also dispute Wales's claim. David Lindsay would respond and claim that Jimmy Wales' first Hello World edit was actually on Nupedia, the predecessor to Wikipedia, thus meaning that Wales's edit was not truly a wiki edit. Starling would also note a test wiki was created and deleted almost a week before the real wiki would be made public, and that Wales most likely posted his Hello World message there. Jiba Fofi, also known as the Congolese giant spider, is a type of large spider said to inhabit the forests of the Congo, although other sightings have taken place across the world. The stories surrounding this creature say the spiders dig a shallow tunnel under tree roots and camouflage it with a large screen of leaves. They then create an almost invisible web between their burrow and a nearby tree, stringing the whole area with a network of trip lines. Then the creature's next meal will trip that line, alerting the spider. The spider then chases the victim down into the web, similar behavior of a trapdoor spider. The eggs are a pale yellow-white and shaped like peanuts. Natives claim the hatchlings are bright yellow with a purple abdomen. Their color becomes darker and brown as they mature. Some of the indigenous peoples claim these spiders were once quite common, but now are very rare, as the last one was sighted in 2014. The first sighting, documented by a Western observer, was in the 1890s by British missionary Arthur John Symes, when him and his men came up on one of these creatures. They had gotten themselves tangled in an enormous web, and two giant spiders, one 2 feet in length, the other 4 feet, presumably male and female, came out of their web and attacked and killed them. Accounts differ from here, as some accounts say Symes was also bitten and died later, while others do not mention this. What is clear is that Symes was able to drive away the spiders with his gun. The next documented sighting happened in 1938 by an English traveling couple passing through a jungle in the Congo. The couple, R.K. Lloyd and his wife, were motoring through the Belgium Congo when they saw a large object crossing the trail in front of them. At first, they thought it was a cat or a monkey, but they soon realized it was a spider with legs nearly 3 feet. Cryptozoologist William J. Gibbons would also claim that on one of his expeditions, natives would tell him about their experiences with the spider, stating the giant ground-dwelling spiders prey on the diminutive forest antelope, birds, and other small game, and are said to be extremely dangerous, not to mention highly venomous. There was also at least one case where a dog was dragged off from a village by one. In September 2018, YouTube user CryptoDragon UK would re-upload a video from 2013 of an alleged sighting captured on night vision camera near a water hole next to a stream in Mozambique. The creature appears out of the darkness for a brief moment, then scurries out into the darkness off the screen. However, the video is far from concrete evidence, and biologists have said that a spider's unique respiratory system isn't strong enough to sustain anything much larger than a bird-eating species of spider. Everyone has seen this iconic photo. Tank Man is the given name for the Chinese man that stood in front of a column of Beijing tanks during the Tiananmen protest. The tank kept trying to maneuver past the man, but he would repeatedly shift his position to block the path. After bringing them to a complete halt, he would climb up onto the tank and have a short conversation with the tank crew member. He would then get back down, and the tanks would restart their engines. The man would again stand in front of them. It's at this point the two figures in blue would pull the man away, disappearing with him into the crowd, most likely the Beijing police, although some have said that it was concerned bystanders. The whole incident would be captured on film. The photograph that was captured by Jeff Widener has gone down as one of the most iconic photos of all time. The photo is still censored in China to this day, but with all that being said, we still have no idea who the man was or what happened to him. Various theories have been put forth, but with nothing concrete to back it. A British tabloid would name the student as Wong Wailan, a 19-year-old student that was charged with political hooliganism and attempting to subvert the members of the People's Liberation Army. But the Hong Kong-based Information Center for Human Rights disputes this. As they say, Chinese Communist Party documents have no record of the man. Bruce Hutchison, a former assistant to President Nixon, claims that the man, whoever he was executed 14 days later. Other sources say several months later, while Canadian journalist Jan Wong claims from her sources that the Chinese government has no idea who he was and further states that he still lives on the mainland. There's also the story from a news agency in South Korea which claimed he escaped to Taiwan and is still employed as an archaeologist in the National Palace Museum. China, for their part, hasn't said much. They have denied he was killed while not confirming if he received a jail sentence or not. I think what makes this whole incident so interesting is the fact that he was carrying 2 bags of groceries at the time of the incident. He wasn't some radical protester, just some dude who went to pick up some pizza rolls and milk and decided to peacefully protest in front of a tank. Pretty gutsy. For what it's worth, at some point, I think the question of who this man was will be answered. Halloween, 1982. 18-year-old James Adamski of Cheektowaga, New York, would dress up in his costume and say goodbye to his family and head out the door to a party at a nearby bar in Depew. The high school senior only had to pay an entry fee and was free to drink all he liked, and James drank up quite a bit. And if you're wondering how an 18-year-old could drink alcohol in a bar, well, in 1982, only 14 states required a person to be 21 to drink, and James happened to be in a state that didn't require it. At sometime in the early morning, he would finally set off for home, which luckily was only 2 miles away. For the first part of his walk, he actually walked with a girl from the party. They would come to an intersection, and they would say goodnight as the girl split off to head another way. James would continue on the short walk towards his home. It was 3:30 in the morning, but he didn't have far to go. The next morning, when James' parents awoke, they would go to check on James in his room and discover he never made it home. His parents knew immediately that something was wrong, as this was not like their son to not come home. Authorities would be contacted, and the police would come out to take a report. Several searches over the coming weeks would take place, and not a clue was found. It wouldn't be until the day after Christmas when 2 hunters found his body. He was still wearing his Halloween costume. Oddly enough, he was about 4 miles away from where he and the girl had split off from each other. The body was next to some railroad tracks right off the road in a wooded area. It was found in a shallow grave with twigs and leaves on top of it. He had been beaten. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. Detectives would start rounding up people that had been at that party. Some reports stated that hundreds of people were interviewed. One key thing they discovered early on and pursued heavily was several witnesses reported that James had gotten into an argument with a few other partygoers. The original detectives would pursue this angle for a while before finally concluding that the argument was in no way connected to the murder. However, by 2017, this theory would be reconsidered when the district attorney stated the 2 strongest theories was something happened at the bar or someone driving by stopped and picked him up. The case would be cold for nearly 40 years, but recently, in 2016, James's costume was sent to a lab for DNA analysis. and in 2017, an $11,000 reward for information leading to an arrest was offered. In 2020, a new theory would also come to light. 3 months after James was murdered, a 17-year-old, David Burr, would be charged with second-degree murder for a torture slaying of another youth who he stabbed over 50 times after forcing him to walk along railroad tracks and then dumping him into a sewer. The victim was a 19-year-old John Borick of Buffalo, just 9 miles from where James was murdered, and adding more similarities, the two boys had gotten into a fistfight at a party when Burr pulled a knife and stabbed him and then made Borick leave the party at knife point. It's here that his torture would begin. He would force a third party, who would later on end up being a witness, to strip Borick before dumping his body. He would then laugh about it before threatening the witness. It's unclear if investigators have ever officially linked the two cases or not. However, the police chief at the time of James's murder was Thomas Fowler, and he would be interviewed in 2018. And when asked if he had an idea who done it, he replied, "I do, yeah, but we don't have the evidence. At least we didn't during my tenure." Halloween, 1979. Just off of I-35 in Georgetown, Texas, two men would drive by what they thought was a mannequin lying in a culvert near the road. They would drive down a bit and turn around and come back to get a second view. When they returned for a second look, they realized it was not a mannequin at all, but a woman. The woman was completely nude except for a pair of orange socks. It would end up being the name the Jane Doe would go by for decades. An investigation would ensue, and it was quickly determined that due to the large amount of visible bruising around her neck, she had almost certainly been strangled. Other bruises were also found, and were determined to have been made from being dropped from the overpass and being dragged through the grass. Bloodstains were also found on the scene. The detectives estimated that she was in her 20s. Clues were scarce, and they had no means of identification. The only promising lead was a silver ring containing an abalone or mother-of-pearl stone that the victim wore. The ring stuck out to investigators, and they believed someone would be able to identify the victim by it. Sadly, that would not happen. A further search revealed a matchbook on the scene that belonged to a hotel in Oklahoma. When they followed up with the said hotel, they could not find the woman in the registry. Because of this, law enforcement postulated that she was a hitchhiker and believed her murder was connected to several other unsolved murders that had taken place along the same section of interstate in Travis County, Texas. With no arrests made and no suspects, the case would go cold. It would remain this way for 13 years until infamous serial killer Henry Lee Lucas would claim orange socks as one of his numerous victims. He would actually end up being convicted of her murder in 1984 and sentenced to death. The problem was, however, there was no physical evidence connecting him. He would come up with a story about how he picked her up hitchhiking and got mad at her, that she tried to flee the vehicle and he ended up killing her there. He claimed she told him her name was Judy or Joni, but in addition to the fact there was no physical evidence, was the fact that interrogators were able to place Lucas several hundred miles away in Florida at the time of the murders. There's also the issue that Lucas was a well-known liar that claimed to be connected to thousands of murders that he really had no involvement with. His execution would be waived, but he did end up spending the rest of his life in prison, as he had committed at least 3 confirmed murders. And although some still believe he was responsible for Orange Socks' murder, the odds are incredibly small. Her story would go on to be featured on America's Most Wanted twice, and although there wasn't much information called in, there was one key piece of info provided. An anonymous caller stated that they had seen her hitchhiking near Georgetown, Texas, the day of the murder, confirming that Henry Lee Lucas could not have killed her in Oklahoma. It would still not be until 40 years later, though, in August 2019, when the Jane Doe known as Orange Socks would finally be identified as Deborah Jackson. The DNA Doe Project had identified a potential cousin of hers through their research, and a new sketch would be completed that her sister recognized. Her family would view the morgue photo and identify Deborah. Things would finally be 100% confirmed after a dental swab from Deborah's sister confirmed they were related. Her family stated she was last seen in 1977, and they never reported her missing, as she would often leave and come back. Others would state her home life had been turbulent. The 2 years between her missing and ending up being found in 1979 remain unclear, although it is known She had at least 3 different jobs in that time frame, and while it was nice to give Deborah her identity back, the mystery of who killed her and why remain. This is a pretty famous mystery that involved a woman that was present during the JFK assassination. The name Babushka Lady comes from the headscarf she was wearing, which looks similar to a scarf worn by elderly Russian women. It is believed she was able to either photograph or film the events that day, and it being in the middle of the Cold War, a potential Russian there recording the assassination, that played out about as well as you would think to the American public. Witnesses stated that she was holding a camera as the vehicle went by, as well as documented by the film accounts that spot her. She was standing on the grass amongst the onlookers, and is visible in the Zapruder film. Curiously, in the Mark Bell film, after the shooting, with the camera at her face, whereas all the other witnesses had already ducked for cover. After the shooting, she crosses the street and joins the crowd on the grassy knoll. She is last seen in photographs walking east on Elm Street. Neither she nor whatever film/photographs she may have taken have ever been identified, and to this day, people have tried to figure out who this woman was. One of the early claims came from a woman named Beverly Oliver. In 1970, she told conspiracy researcher Gary Shaw that she was the Babushka Lady. He claimed that she also told him that she had gave the undeveloped film to 2 men who identified themselves as FBI agents. They gave her no receipt and never returned the film, even though they claimed she would receive it back in 10 days. Strangely enough, the woman would also state she never bothered following up. She would stand by these claims on a documentary nearly 20 years later. Most people disregard her claims though, especially since she originally claimed that she shot the film on a Super 8 film Yashica, only to be told by investigators that camera didn't come out until 1969. She would counter by saying she never stated for sure what the model was, which was a lie. Furthermore, she would claim she was a witness to some elements of the Martin Luther King Jr. murder, meaning the woman was basically full of it. As for who it could have really been, opinions vary. Some state that it was a Russian spy, some think she was an assassin holding a camera gun, some a Secret Service agent. Of course, you get the typical theory that it was a man dressed as an older woman for some reason. Others point out that it may have not been a camera at all, but a pair of binoculars. In May of 1973, 2 young children, Faye, who was 7 years old, and an unnamed boy of a similar age, would have one of the more bizarre encounters we have seen so far, as the 2 were vacationing with their family at Lake Common Sandown, a seaside town at the Isle of Wight, England. The 2 children were playing outside around 4 p.m. when they heard a weird wailing of an ambulance siren. The kids would go follow the sound. That noise would eventually end though, but the kids moved forward to where they last heard it. Eventually crossing a footbridge, they would then come across a bizarre being that can only be described as a clown robot. It had very white skin, like that of paper, and its face appeared to have been painted onto the surface of the head, with 2 blue triangles that were supposed to be the eyes, and a flat brown rectangle that was supposed to be the nose, and a mouth that had thin yellow lips shaped like an oval, and did not move when it spoke. Its hair hung down beneath a hat, and was sparse, frizzled, and in reddish-brown strands. It had 2 wooden antennae that stuck out from the side of its head. Its hands and feet possessed only 3 digits each, taken from the Bufora Journal of 1978. Quote, "He was nearly 7 feet tall and had no neck, for his head appeared to be wedged straight onto his shoulders. He wore a yellow, pointed hat, which interlocked with the red collar of a green tunic. A round black knob was affixed to the top of his hat, and wooden antennae were attached to either side. The face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square of a nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings were on his paper white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. Wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trousers." End quote. It carried a black knob microphone as well, which is what it spoke through. After it grabbed the mic, the strange wailing sound returned, and the kids ran away. The being realized that he scared the children and stopped the wailing and spoke to them. Quote,
"Hello, are you still there?"
End quote. The kids would go closer to talk to him, and they said he lived in a 2-story metallic hut or shack in a wooded area close to the lake. Its walls were papered with blue-green dial patterns and had metallic floors. It also contained wooden furniture and an electric heater. The clown being was shy, but friendly. It told the kids it was afraid of humans. It would not defend itself if it were attacked. It would only drink water from the stream after cleaning it. It also lived on wild berries, which it gathered. Reading again from the Befora journal, quote, "Before eating a berry, he performed an odd conjuring trick. He placed the berry in his ear, thrust his head forward, and caused the berry to disappear and reappear at one of his odd eyes. Repeating the process, the berry traveled to his mouth. Possible explanation could be that he was wearing some kind of protective mask and analyzing the berry to check that it wasn't poisonous." End quote. The being would then tell the kids that his name was All Colors Sam. They would ask him if he was a ghost, and he said, quote, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." End quote. The British UFO Research Association would actually investigate this, but they could not find a shack nearby, nor had workers near the site reported anything like this. This account has always been viewed as significant, as the children's story never changed, even up into adulthood. They were also surprised by the amount of details given. This is the one and only encounter with this bizarre being. Theories range on what it was. Some think it was a human wearing a costume and just playing around with the kids. Others claim that it was a fairy, ghost, or some type of paranormal being, while others claim a robot, alien, children's imagination, a cryptid, or just a straight up hoax. On April 3rd, 2004, Alonzo Brooks would travel with 3 friends to a party in Seine, Kansas, about 50 miles south of Gardner, where the 23-year-old worked as a custodian. Alonzo was of African American and Mexican descent, and it's alleged that at this party, there were some racial slurs uttered towards Brooks, possibly causing tension between him and some other people there, while some witnesses state that this was possibly due to the fact that Brooks was flirting with a white woman, and others state that some drunken white men just wanted to fight him. Regardless, he was challenged to a fight, and according to investigations later, there were fights at this party, which consisted of 100 16 to 25-year-olds, and due to a misunderstanding between Brooks and his friends, all 3 would end up leaving the party without him, with each one thinking the other one was going to give him a ride home. This little mistake would come back to haunt them, because the next day, Brooks had still not returned home, and his family would go to Seine to search for him. After not being able to find him, they would go to the local authorities. The Lynn County Sheriff's Department would be called, and they found Alonzo's boots and hat pretty quickly in the weeds across the street from the farmhouse where the party had been. They would then search by air and land and found nothing else. After 2 days, they would turn the case over to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The FBI would eventually come in as well, and yet Brooks was still not found. But a month later, on May 1st, the family would be given permission to search the party house property for their son, citing that law enforcement was not telling them anything. So they just went over to the property owner and asked to search. And depending on which source you read, it only took half an hour or an hour and a half to find him. He was tangled in a brush pile on a creek bed. His body was well preserved and did not look like it sat out in the elements for over a month, but the autopsy was strange in the fact that it didn't find any sign of blunt force trauma, or any injury really, and he also had not drowned. The autopsy, done by Dr. Eric Mitchell, would state that the cause of death could not be determined, but Mitchell, well, he had relocated to Kansas after being investigated for misconduct as chief medical examiner in upstate New York, which included harvesting organs and improperly storing skeletons in his office. He was not charged, but he was asked to resign, meaning his conclusion in this was heavily questioned. But in 2019, Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries would bring attention back to the case, and just a year later, in June 2020, the FBI would reopen it and offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to Brooks' death, and a month later, they would exhume the body and transport it to Dover Air Force Base for another autopsy. This time, the Armed Forces medical examiner was able to determine that Brooks' death was due to homicide. The acting U.S. attorney would comment that the FBI had known since the early investigation that the death had suspicious circumstances, but it wasn't until this autopsy that they had proof. He also stated he believed multiple people knew what happened that night and called on someone to come forward. The autopsy said there were injuries that were not consistent with decomposition, and as far as theories go, well, there's many. One is that Alonzo's friends set him up to be killed by drug dealers, and citing the hat and boot found next to the highway, some think Alonzo was drunk and hitchhiking, only to be picked up by someone who killed him. Others say he was chased down the driveway and attacked by some of the partygoers. There's also the part about the body being well preserved. It's led to speculation that the body was stored in a large freezer, which means someone probably helped. In the summer of 1943, an American soldier was helping to clear the site at the back of a Methodist church in Liverpool, England, which had just been recently bombed by the Germans. An American bulldozer would uncover a cylinder while clearing building debris. It was 6'9" and had a diameter of 19 inches. One end of the cylinder was capped with a steel plate, which bolted into place. The other end was open, but had been compressed and almost crimped shut by the bulldozer, which accidentally crushed it while moving it. It appeared to be a ventilation shaft from a ship. It would be pushed out of the way and left to the side for a couple of years. The cylinder would then basically blend into the background, only being used sometimes as a seat, and was often played with by children who liked to roll it around. Fast forward 2 years to July 13th, 1945. 3 small boys were playing with the cylinder. As they rode it along in the streets, one of the boys attempted to see what was inside, when they noticed what they thought was a shoe. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a skeleton. The boys would go get an adult, who called the police. The authorities would then open the cylinder with an oxyacetylene torch and found a complete skeleton with a number of items. The remains were of a male around 6 foot tall and aged 25 to 50. The skull was broken near the middle left ear, but it didn't appear to be from violence. They at first thought that the man had crawled up into the cylinder during the German bombing, but that was ruled out after they discovered the skeleton was pretty old. However, he did crawl in it for some reason, because there was also a brick found wrapped in sacking that he was using as a pillow. He had also put something down to lay on, and the age of the skeleton, well, his clothing was traced back to the Victorian period, and they were good quality clothing. Found on the body was 2 diaries, 7 heavily rusted keys, and miscellaneous papers. The diaries were largely unreadable, but one clearly read, quote, "Appointments for 1 p.m. with F.C. Greedy at Cons," end quote. A postcard dated July 3rd, 1885, a handkerchief, a brooch, a gold ring that had the hallmark of London 1859, a London Northwestern Railway note dated to June 27th, 1885, 5 account sheets, and 1 receipt. So who was this man? And how did he end up in this cylinder? And how long was he there? The coroner would state that due to insufficient evidence, it was impossible to reach a cause of death, but they believe he had died in the year 1885. And as far as his identity, the best guess they had was a man named Thomas Williams, who was a paint and brush manufacturer. He was declared bankrupt on March 10th, 1884, and it's believed that he left his home due to his financial difficulties and was sleeping in the cylinder at what is assumed to be his business premises. Somehow, the cylinder was sealed with him in it, causing him to smother, most likely because of the way he had laid in it, had blocked the airflow. It's thought that at the time, his disappearance was intentional, and that most people likely believed he had fled his creditors and went to another country, hiding aboard a ship. And finally, more proof that it was probably Williams, is that his burial was never found, as the spot next to his wife was never used, nor is there a record of him ever dying. But some think Williams used the skeleton to fake his own death to escape creditors. Mokele-mbembe, which translates to "one who stops the flow of rivers," is a water-dwelling cryptid that lives in the Congo River Basin. It looks very similar to the brontosaurus. It too has 4 legs, a long neck, a single tooth, and smooth skin. The first description that related it to the brontosaurus comes from 1909 in the autobiography of Carl Hagenbeck, who was a big game hunter. He claimed to have heard from 2 separate sources about the creature living in Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. He said the natives described it as half elephant, half dragon. Hagenbeck would write, "It can only be some kind of dinosaur, seemingly akin to the brontosaurus." Another account, by a German captain sent to Cameroon in 1913, would state that the animal is said to be of a brownish gray color with smooth skin, its size approximately that of an elephant, at least that of a hippopotamus. It is said to have a long and very flexible neck and only one tooth, but a very long one. Some say it is a horn. A few spoke about a long, muscular tail like that of an alligator. Canoes coming near it are said to be doomed. The animal is said to attack the vessels at once and to kill the crews, but without eating the bodies. The creature is said to live in the caves that have been washed out by the river, in the clay of its shores at sharp bends. It is said to climb the shores, even at daytime, in search of food. Its diet is said to be entirely vegetable. So does this cryptid actually exist? Scientists say probably not. They cite the lack of physical evidence. They say that what the villagers are more than likely seeing is just a black rhino. Adding to this is the fact that several expeditions have been launched to find the creature and have never came back with solid proof, along with Google Maps satellite images that have captured elephant herds, yet somehow haven't seen this giant of a creature. But for the believers, they tend to fall into three different categories. Some speculate that it's some kind of undiscovered dinosaur that is similar to a mid-sized brontosaurus. Others believe it's a giant reptile or lizard, something like a giant long-necked freshwater turtle, or possibly even a giant iguana. Then there are the ones who believe it is a mammal, like a supergiant pangolin. Finally, there's the thought that the whole thing has never been nothing more than a hoax. Chances are you know the name Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, and you probably know he was a leader for the Mongol Empire, which conquered about 18% of the world's landmass and about 31% of the world's population. But because this happened so long ago, and because it happened in the East, it's really hard for people to fathom just how destructive the Mongols were. It is believed they are directly responsible for about 38 to 60 million deaths alone, which was about 11% of the world's population at the time. Persia and Hungary alone lost around 2 million people each from their invasions, but we know all about that. What we don't know is, how did Genghis Khan die, and where was he placed afterwards? It's been the subject of much speculation. According to legend, he asked to be buried without markings or any sign, and that he wanted his body returned to Mongolia. Khan would die in 1227, and even just a few decades later, when Marco Polo came through, the Mongols at the time had no idea where he had been buried. Another issue with his burial site is just the amount of legends that surround it. Marco Polo would state that 2,000 slaves had attended his funeral, but were then killed by the soldiers that were sent to guard them. But then those soldiers were killed by another group of soldiers, which killed anyone that crossed their path on the way to bury Khan. This has been pretty much proven false though, but there's other stories as well, such as the Mongols rediverted a river to flow over his grave, making it impossible to find, which is probably just someone copying the story of the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. Another legend states that his grave was stampeded over and over by many horses. Then the Mongols planted trees over it, while other sources claim that his coffin was empty when it arrived back in Mongolia. Likewise, other tales claim that only his shirt, tent, and boots arrived. Legends aside, most modern researchers believe he is buried somewhere near the Mongol sacred mountain, Burkhan-Khaldun. It was said that this is the place where Genghis Khan would go to pray to the sky god Tengri before embarking on his campaign to unite the Mongols and steppe peoples. After the rise of the empire, no one could visit this area unless they were the Mongol royal family. There are still a few searches that pop up now and again looking for his tomb, but the Mongolian government has always been reluctant to let anyone do excavations in the region. Also is the fact that since he was buried without a marker, just like other Mongols, it's likely that he will never be found. It's even possible that his grave has already been found, and the researcher just didn't know that it was him. On January 25th, 2010, at the site of a former car park in Angel Meadow, Manchester, England, construction had just begun to turn this parking lot into some new offices, but a workman on the site would notice a skull, which then led to the discovery of a human skeleton concealed beneath sections of blue carpet. Even though this was a high-trafficked area, the body lay behind a fence in a vacant parking lot, so police had no idea how long the body had really been there. It is believed she suffered a violent death due to a fractured neck and jaw. She was also sexually assaulted. She is believed to have been born between 1950 and 1954, and was murdered sometime between 1978 and 1988. Police believe that she was most likely European, but it is possible she came from India or the Middle East. She was between 5'1" and 5'7". She was found in a green pinafore dress with large buttons that had a 70s style look to it. She also wore a blue jumper, blue bra, and a pair of black stiletto shoes. At the scene also lay 3 different carpets, one blue, one orange, and one dark blue, as well as a portion of a plastic Guinness measuring chart that dated from the late 60s, and a pair of tights and a handbag. One of the carpet pieces that covered the body was thought to have came from a Ford Cortina that featured a hole cut for the gear stick. There's obviously 2 mysteries here. Just who was this woman, and what happened to her? By 2012, police had actually narrowed the list down to 21 to 22 women that this Jane Doe could be. They ran down leads from Ireland all the way to Texas, but the individual that police are most interested in is a woman from Tanzania. She was brought to the attention of investigators by the woman's family. However, due to the obvious sensitive nature of this case, none of these potential matches have ever been released to the public, and it won't be until it's confirmed. The last update on this case that I could find comes from 2020, when a potential witness came forward. A man in his 70s now claimed that he went to this bar that he frequented in the 70s. He knew of the barmaid there. No first name basis or anything, but he had seen her on previous visits. He would claim that he had taken a shine to her over time, and that they would chat. It was this day, though, that she would show him some bruising on her face, neck, and shoulder. The witness would tell her that no one deserved that, and to leave her abusive relationship. She would tell him she had no family here and nowhere to go. The witness then told her that his parents would let her hide with them until she could get on her feet, but the woman said she couldn't. While this conversation was taking place, another man walked in, and the barmaid told the witness to be quiet. He was able to put together that this was the man abusing her, as she seemed frightened when he showed up. He also said the guy was pretty controlling of her. After seeing the report on the news about her and the dress that she wore, he knew immediately that this was her, so he called the police. Detectives, for their part, have investigated this lead and said they appreciated the tip and any tips they can get. However, they have never spoke to the validity of the claim. There is DNA, and it's been used to rule out 400 missing women. There is hope that in the future, they can find this woman's identity with familial DNA testing. On February 23, 1968, the nude body of a 25-year-old woman named Patricia Docker was found in the doorway of a lock-up garage by a man on his way to work in Carmichael Place, Battlefield, Glasgow. She was only yards away from her home. Her body showed extensive blunt force trauma, particularly to the face. She had also been strangled to death. Her handbag, watch, and clothes were all missing, and the clothes were never found, although her handbag was later found in a nearby river, as well as her watch, which was found in a pool of water close to the scene. Police would look around the neighborhood and found out that one witness had heard a woman scream, "Leave me alone," the night before. Police would go to speak to the woman's parents and found that she had spent the evening at Barrowland Ballroom, most likely because the venue had a night specifically for people over 25, and Patricia was also recently separated. An autopsy revealed she had most likely been punched and kicked repeatedly before being sexually assaulted and strangled. Over a year and a half later, on August 16, 1969, a 31-year-old mother named Jemima McDonald would spend an evening dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. According to her family, she was a regular attendee. At around midnight, she was seen by several witnesses dancing with a young, well-dressed, and well-spoken man of slim build, between 25 to 35 years old and about 6 foot to 6'1" tall. He had short, dark brown hair and spoke with a distinctive Glaswegian accent. They would leave together shortly after midnight, and they were last spotted going in the direction of her home around 12:40 a.m. Her body would actually end up being discovered by her sister, who had went looking for her. The autopsy revealed that just like Patricia, she had been severely beaten and sexually assaulted before being strangled to death with one of her own stockings. But the maniac wasn't done. As Halloween rolled around, a man walking his dog would stumble across the body of 29-year-old Helen Puttick behind a tenement. Her body was found near a drain pipe in the back garden, and again, beaten and strangled. This time, the contents of her handbag had been scattered about, and the bag had been taken. She had also put up a ferocious fight, and had tried to scale a nearby railway embankment on an attempted escape. There was also a deep bite mark on her upper thigh, and this time, there would be a better witness account, as the evening prior, Helen and her sister, Jean Langford, had both went to the ballroom, and they both met a man named John. The four would leave together, but the John that had danced with Jean left for the night, leaving the two sisters and suspect to ride a taxi home. During this ride, this John would say he did not drink alcohol, and would repeatedly quote Old Testament stories, particularly about Moses, and said the dance hall was a, quote, adulterous den of iniquity, end quote, and his disapproval of married women visiting there. Detectives believed the man was not a religious man. Instead, they believed he was just well read on the Bible and liked to boast about it. Despite the extensive manhunt and more than 110 detectives who were assigned to the case full-time and well over 5,000 suspects questioned, the man was never apprehended. Detectives believe he either ended up in jail for another offense, died, or checked himself into a mental hospital, although there is some tightly held speculation that there was at least a couple of senior officers that knew the man's identity, but couldn't gain enough evidence to arrest him, while others speculate he simply moved away or stopped visiting the Glasgow district due to his job, and there's not even a consensus on who this guy may have been. Some even think that the first murder isn't related to the last two, since the first occurred a year and a half prior, which is unusual for a serial killer. Although some argue against that point, some recent conjecture has speculated that one of the senior officers was covering up for the real perp, as he was allegedly a relative of someone close to the senior officer. L'Inconnu de la Seine, or as translated to English, the unknown woman of the Seine, is a death mask of a young woman that was pulled out of the river Seine in Paris around the late 1880s. The body showed no signs of violence, and the suspected cause of death was suicide. The pathologist at the morgue was so struck by her beauty, he felt compelled to make a wax plaster cast of her face, although people had pointed out that the expression on this face could not belong to that of a drowned person. That's when the other versions of the story comes in. The painter Joseph Lefebvre said the impression was taken from the face of a young model who had died of tuberculosis around 1875, while other stories say the mask came from the daughter of a mask manufacturer in Germany. However, the identity of the girl has never been established, and there's not really any clues either. Although, some have speculated that she was probably around the age of 16. The popularity of this figure is pretty amazing too, as there were numerous copies of this mask made, which is kinda weird to me. According to some, tons of young girls at the time would model their looks on her. Most famously, and probably where you have seen it, is the CPR doll, which was created in 1958 and has been used in numerous CPR courses since 1960. And although we'll most likely never know her true identity, it's somewhat comforting knowing she contributed to saving countless lives without ever knowing it. On November 24th, 1997, a woman named Marlene Aisenberg would wake up to every parent's worst nightmare. It would start at 6 a.m. As Marlene made her way into the kitchen, she noticed the laundry room door to the garage was open. Thinking it was odd, but not overly alarmed, she went to check on her 5-month-old daughter, Sabrina, and shockingly, Sabrina was missing from her crib. The authorities were called immediately. Upon arriving to the scene and talking to the Aisenbergs, they would learn that the two had left the garage door open overnight, which they occasionally did, while also leaving the laundry room door unlocked, which they just forgot. Investigation of the scene revealed an unidentified shoe print, along with the blonde hair in Sabrina's room, and unidentified fingerprints in the house that the Aisenbergs believed belonged to the kidnapper. Neighbors also told investigators that there had been several incidents involving possible attempted break-ins in homes with small children recently, as well as one neighbor that stated that his dog started barking at 1 a.m. in the morning of Sabrina's disappearance, and when he let the dog outside, he thought he heard a baby crying in the distance. And speaking of dogs, the Aisenbergs had a house dog that apparently did not bark at this intruder, which investigators found odd. Unfortunately for the Aisenbergs, the detectives ignored all these clues and instead focused on the parents. They would deny it, of course, but the FBI would take several items from the home, including the crib and the bedding. The Aisenbergs would then go to the media to plead for Sabrina's safe return, and for some reason, law enforcement found this suspicious. In addition was the video that showed the Aisenbergs smiling as they left their home, which struck people the wrong way, including the investigators. The Aisenbergs by this time were tired of the accusations and agreed to take a polygraph. Marlene would claim that the investigators told her that her results were inconclusive and that they expected that because she was crying. However, the sheriff's office stated that the results were not inconclusive, but they refused to release the results. The Aisenbergs would now hire a lawyer since they were being considered suspects. Although they would take polygraphs again in 2005 and claim that they passed, but police would not confirm that. And here's where things kinda end as far as things we know for sure. Law enforcement has declined to comment on any evidence, but they have stated that the Aisenbergs have not been very cooperative and that they can't rule them out yet, mainly because there was no sign of forced entry and no ransom demand, as well as the strange press conference where they were seen smiling. They were also suspicious of a video taken of Sabrina just a few days before she vanished. Some detectives felt that the baby had bruises on her face, as well as a patch of hair missing from her head. The Aisenbergs, for their part, have stuck to their belief that someone broke in and took Sabrina. By November of 1999, 2 years later, Steve and Marlene were both arrested and charged with conspiracy, lying to investigators, and giving false information about Sabrina's disappearance. Investigators had made secret recordings of the two's conversations and claimed Marlene said, quote, "The baby's dead and buried," end quote, while Steve said, quote, "I wish I hadn't harmed her," end quote. But when a judge actually listened to these, he would drop all the charges against them, claiming the prosecutor exaggerated the strength of the case, citing that the recorded conversations were so garbled that you couldn't make anything out of it. There's basically two theories in this one. The first being that someone desperate for a baby knew that the Aisenbergs sometimes left the garage door open and went in during the middle of the night and took Sabrina. The investigators then got tunnel vision and locked in on the parents and never pursued any other line of thought. Or the Aisenbergs are responsible. On April 27, 1990, Deputy Agricultural Commissioner Joe Carl would be sent to Santa Cruz Island off the coast of California to search for any old pesticides to be removed and safely disposed of. The ranch on this island had once belonged to a wealthy California family who left it to their son, Dr. Cary Stanton. He would take over in 1957 and ran it until 1987 when he too passed away. And Dr. Stanton, well, he was an eccentric man in his own right. He never married and basically lived in solitude on the island, to which he owned 90% of. For the remainder of his life, he was known to be a very rigid man. He went to bed at the exact same time every day, woke up at the exact same time every day, ate at the same time every day. He meticulously labeled everything. So it must have surprised Joe Carl, the man sent to remove any pesticides from the island, when he was walking across the vast ranch and came across an old wooden seed shed. And in that shed, he found an unusual and tightly sealed copper box tucked away in a cabinet. And on this box, there was no labels. Joe would open the box and found what appeared to be cremated human remains. He would show the remains to Marla Daly, who had been Stanton's longtime personal assistant, and she had no idea where they had came from. Joe would contact the deputy coroner, who would search through the ashes and found a clothes fastener made from the 40s, several false teeth from the 50s, and a diamond-studded platinum ring that predated World War II. He also found nails, staples, and screws, which had most likely been from a coffin. The coroner would go on to state that what fragments he could find led him to believe the person had been an elderly woman that was cremated sometime in the 50s or 60s. The question was who? Was Cary hiding a dark secret? Investigators kinda doubted this, as Stanton was so uptight about labeling items, although I guess most people wouldn't label any of their possessions as murder victim remains. However, because of the metal nails, staples, and screws found, authorities were sure that foul play was not involved, because as mentioned, this was most likely from a coffin. It's also not known if Stanton even knew this woman. The remains would be buried with a cross and an unmarked grave, and her identity is still a mystery. There's not many theories about this one. The main one seems to be that one of the ranch workers at the island intended to bury her remains, and for whatever reason never did. The will-o-wisp is a type of ghost light that is seen by travelers at night, typically over swampland It is known in English folklore to have misled travelers because of its resemblance to a flickering lamp or lantern, but it appears in numerous other cultures as well. Some of the famous ones in the US include the Spooklight of southwestern Missouri and northeastern Oklahoma, the Marfa Lights of Texas, and the Paulding Light of Michigan. Yet there are many more. It's also largely connected to the paranormal, as many people attribute it to ghosts, fairies, or some type of spirit. Yet, skeptics claim that the light is due to natural phenomena, such as the ever-famous swamp gas, that is used to excuse basically every type of paranormal activity. I mean, come on skeptics, at least come up with something new. All jokes aside, this was even mentioned going as far back as 1596 in a book by theologian Ludwig Lavater. Quote, "Many times candles and small fires appear in the night and seem to run up and down. Sometimes these fires go alone in the night season and put such as see them as they travel by night in great fear. But these things, and many such like, have their natural causes. Natural philosophers write that thick exhalations arise out of the earth and are kindled, mines full of sulfur and brimstone. If the air enter unto it, as it lieth in the hose and veins of the earth, will kindle on fire and strive to get out." End quote. Although this has been dismissed by other scholars, such as American anthropologist John Owens, who in 1891 wrote, quote, "This is a name that is sometimes applied to the phenomenon perhaps more frequently called jack-o'-the-lantern or will-o'-the-wisp. It seems to be a ball of fire, varying in size from that of a candle flame to that of a man's head. It is generally observed in damp, marshy places, moving to and fro, but it has been known to stand perfectly still and send off scintillations. As you approach it, it will move on, keeping just beyond your reach. If you retire, it will follow you. That these fireballs do occur and that they will repeat your motion seems to be established, but no satisfactory explanation has yet been offered that I have heard. Those who are less superstitious say that it is the ignition of the gases rising from the marsh, but how a light produced from burning gas could have the form described and move as described, advancing as you advance, receding as you recede, and at other times remaining stationary without having any visible connection with the earth is not clear to me." End quote. Another theory proposed is that of foxfire, which is the bioluminescence created by some types of fungus on decaying wood, which tends to give a bluish-green glow. Strangely enough, fireflies have also been proposed. Also, the white plumage of barn owls, which really seems to be a reach to me. The Agogwe is an alleged cryptid that was first reported in East Africa. It's supposed to be a 4 to 5 feet tall, smallish man with brown or rusty colored hair all over its body. It has long arms and yellowish red skin under its coat, sometimes described as copper. Its feet are said to be about 5 inches long. It differs from that of a chimpanzee in that it has a rounded forehead and smaller but sharper teeth. The first report comes from Captain William Hitchens in December of 1937 in an edition of the journal Discovery, when quoting an expedition he had went on in 1900, 37 years prior. Quote, "Some years ago, I was sent on an official lion hunt in this area, and while waiting in a forest glade for a man-eater, I saw 2 small brown furry creatures come from the dense forest on one side of the glade and disappear into the thickets on the other. They were like little men, about 4 feet high, walking upright, but clad in russet hair. The native hunter with me gazed in mingled fear and amazement. They were, he said, Agogwe, the little furry men whom one does not see once in a lifetime." End quote. The following year, a wine merchant would write a similar letter to the journal, yet he would claim the events happened in 1927. He stated, quote, "We were sufficiently near to land to see objects clearly with a glass of 12 magnifications. There was a sloping beach with light bush upon which several dozen baboons were hunting for and picking up shellfish or crabs, to judge by their movements. 2 pure white baboons were amongst them. These are very rare, but I had heard of them previously. As we watched, 2 little brown men walked together out of the bush and down amongst the baboons. They were certainly not any known monkey, and yet they must have been akin, or they would have disturbed the baboons. They were too far away to be seen in great detail. But these small human-like animals were probably between 4 and 5 feet tall, quite upright and graceful in figure, end quote. But you have to wonder, in both of these cases, why they waited so long to tell anyone. By the late 50s, professional animal collector Charles Cordier would also report seeing it in Zaire, as it had become entangled in one of the bird snares he had set, but escaped before he could get to it. Quote, "It fell on its face, turned over, sat up, took the noose off its feet, and walked away before the nearby African could do anything," end quote. Some think that it could indicate the possible survival of gibbons in Africa, which are small tailless apes with rounded foreheads and small canines, while some speculate that it's a rare type of monkey. Others propose it could be a surviving species of Australopithecine, a bipedal primate that lived around 2.5 million years ago. On April 5th, 1986, Penny Cayedito of Gallup, New Mexico, would meet up with some friends and go out to a local bar. Before going, she would get a babysitter for her daughters, 9-year-old Anthonette, 7-year-old Sadie, and 5-year-old Wendy. Penny would then spend the evening with her friends and came back around midnight and dismissed the babysitter. Penny would then go to bed herself. The next morning at 7 a.m., Penny would wake up in order to prepare the girls for Bible school, but when she got to Anthonette's room, she did not see her. She would search the home before checking throughout the neighborhood until 11 a.m., but she could not find Anthonette. So Penny returned home and called the police. The police would tell Penny she had to wait 8 hours before making a missing persons report. A search for her later would begin, yet yielded no results. An investigation then would ensue, and detectives learned from Anthonette's 5-year-old sister Wendy that someone had came to the door that night at 3 a.m. identifying themselves as Uncle Joe. Anthonette would get up to answer the door, and Wendy allegedly went back to sleep, and that was the last time she seen her. Neighbors would also report that an older model brown truck was outside the home between 6:30 and 7 a.m., around the time that Penny awoke. The neighbor then said the man walked toward the home, yet the neighbor could not see him or the vehicle good enough to get a great description. The case would go cold, but a year later, the Gallup Police Department received a frantic phone call from a young girl who claimed to be Anthonette. She would state that she was in Albuquerque, which is a little over 2 hours east of Gallup. Before she could reveal her exact location, an adult was heard shouting, quote, "Who said you could use the phone?" end quote, followed by Anthonette screaming, then sounds of a scuffle and the phone call being cut off. The entire thing lasted about 40 seconds. Penny would get to listen to the call and stated that it was her belief that it was Anthonette. 4 years passed by, and in 1991, a waitress working in Carson City, Nevada, about 13 and a half hours away from Gallup, would encounter a teenager who matched Anthonette's description, and she was in the company of a scruffy-looking couple. The teenager kept knocking her utensils on the floor, and when the waitress handed them back to her, she noted that the girl grabbed her hand and squeezed firmly, as if it was some attempt to get her attention. After they left, the waitress cleaned their table and found a napkin under the plate, which contained the messages that read, "Help me," and "Call the police," written on it. Also happening around this time was Wendy, the 5-year-old sister, who was now 10, would give a more detailed account of what had happened that night. She claimed both her and Anthonette heard a knock at 3 a.m., and that person identified himself as Uncle Joe. When Anthonette opened the door, she was grabbed by 2 men, and she started to kick and scream. They covered her mouth and then took her to a brown van that Wendy said she did not recognize. As far as the theories go, the 2 most plausible ones is that she was a victim of homicide or human trafficking. And as far as suspects go, there are none. Well, at least none that were publicly named. Although, investigators have long assumed that the mother Penny knows more than she ever said, and there's good reason for this. First off, she took a lie detector test, and the results were inconclusive or failed, depending on which source you read. And we know lie detector tests can't be taken seriously. But there are other reasons. For one, both siblings would state later as adults that Anthonette was more like a mother to them, as she was basically taking care of them. But perhaps the most damning is the fact that Penny made several expensive purchases after Anthonette was abducted, leaving investigators to theorize that the abductors and Penny were paid by the couple in Nevada for Anthonette. However, Others disagree and believe Penny was not involved, besides she may have been trying to cover up for the fact that she was dealing in drugs, which gave off the appearance that she was trying to cover up for what happened to Anthonette. On September 5th, 2012, at 3:45 p.m., a former British RAF pilot, Brett Martin, who now lived in France, was out riding his bicycle near the French Alps. After crossing a bridge that spanned over a river, he would continue to ride for a few hundred meters when he crossed a horrifying scene. In his field of vision was a young girl stumbling into the road and collapsing right in front of his track. Brett at first thought she might be playing until he got closer. The 7-year-old, Zainab Al-Hili, had been shot in the shoulder and beaten with a gun. He then began to look at the entire scene and could tell that the vehicle had been reversed sharply into the rest area. The car's engine was still running and the gear was still in reverse, with the rear wheels spinning about in the sand. In front of the car lay a French cyclist, Sylvain Maillet, who had been shot 7 times. And in the car, Brett seen 3 people, all dead. That being an Iraqi-born British tourist named Saad Al-Hili, 50 years old, his wife, Iqbal, 47, and her mother, Sahala Al-Alaf, 74. Investigators arrived to the scene and counted 25 shots, or, by some sources, 21, that had been fired. The weapon of choice was a semi-automatic pistol Luger P06 with an 8-round magazine. The young girl, Zainab, who had collapsed in front of the vehicle, was rushed to the hospital and miraculously survived. But maybe the craziest part was after the police closed the scene off and started their investigation, they would interview a neighbor at the campground where the family had been staying. This neighbor would tell them about the other little girl who had not been found yet. When police went back to check, they found 4-year-old Zena hidden under the legs of her dead mother in the rear footwell. She had hidden that spot for 8 hours. That's sad, but at least she survived. France and Britain agreed to create a joint investigation team. One of the early suspects was Saad's own brother, Zaid. He would be taken in the following year in connection with the murder, with the motive alleged to have been a family squabble over money. He would eventually be released, however, as there was no real evidence. Another clue that came out early in the investigation was that of a gray BMW X5, which was at the crime scene at the time, and it's thought that the driver might have been an accomplice. And then there's also the report of a motorcycle rider with a weird helmet that was also there and thought to be an accomplice. He was eventually tracked down and ruled out, but then detained again and questioned and released. Detectives assumed at first that Sylvain Maillet was the real target, since he was shot 7 times. However, a counter theory was proposed that it's possible that Sylvain could have been the first to see what the gunman was up to and rushed the shooter, hence the suspect being enraged and shot him more times. It's also here that investigators figured out that Saad had made a break for it back to the vehicle while the suspect was shooting Maillet. He would then be shot in the back, but he did make it to the car. In his panic, he reversed too far and got stuck on the soft sandy ground, which allowed the suspect to walk over and kill all of the trapped victims. This brings me back to the 2 daughters. It is not known if he simply ran out of ammo and chose to beat Zainab while leaving Zena, or if he simply chose to spare both of them. There are a ton of theories on this case, and I'm not going to list all of them due to time constraints. I'm just going to go with the one favored by investigators now, and that is the lone psychopath theory. And although that is very rare, and people don't want to accept it because it doesn't make sense without a motive, there's one big clue that points toward this being the reality, and that is, neither Sylvain Maillet nor the Al-Hili family had planned to be in that location that day. Also, investigators can pretty much rule out that either one of them were followed. The Al-Hili family ended up being there only after taking a wrong turn, whereas Maillet told his girlfriend last minute he was changing up his intended route, which is why he ended up there. The atmospheric jellyfish is an alleged cryptid, although sometimes classified as UFO, seen floating throughout the atmosphere. There's been hundreds of sightings observed all over the globe, and what makes these sightings particularly noteworthy is that it has been seen by some of the top meteorological scientists in the world, so there's no dispute that they exist. It's more a question of what they really are. The first confirmed sighting came on September 20th, 1977, over Lake Onega in Russia. It was sighted by hundreds of the locals in the area around 4:15 a.m. and was a star-like light that came nearer and descended in a spiral trajectory and then looked like a ball of fire. It reduced its speed and hovered in the same spot for 6 minutes. It then supposedly made a terrible sound like that of a siren. It would then go silent and move towards the town. Then, hundreds of rays of lights would hit the earth, and whatever this was, now looked like a big jellyfish with golden tentacles and shining with beautiful colors. It would finally make its way to the harbor, where it got so bright that people could not even look at it, before turning into an elliptical ring and floating up through the clouds and disappearing. The whole thing lasted about 12 minutes. Another one of the more famous sightings happened just a few years ago, on June 1st, 2015, as Harry Purton of the Netherlands had went out to take photos of a storm. As he was taking the photos, he would capture a flash of light he thought was lightning, until he got home and observed the photo, as you can see here. Another recent one came on January 20th, 2010, by photographer Per Aron Mikkelsen over Andines, Norway. He was fascinated with the northern lights, which he was able to see that night, and as he was taking a picture of them, he would capture a picture of a jellyfish. At first, he thought it was a spot on his camera lens, but after he posted the picture online, one scientist would state that it was not the camera's fault, and he claimed that the jellyfish was where the northern lights were bouncing off an external source like a satellite, causing an iridium flare, which appear as bright white flashes in the sky. And this is pretty much the same conclusion that NASA has reached, claiming that these so-called cryptids are nothing more than space debris reflecting off the northern lights, or possibly even weather balloons or clouds. But one problem with this theory is that the light intensity from the northern lights is 100,000 times weaker than the sunlight, and there's also the fact that the jellyfish are green and not white, like the reflection from a satellite should be. On June 25th, 1973, Randy Needham and Judy Johnson were parked on a boat dock near Big Muddy River in Murfreesboro, Illinois. The two were in search of some alone time, but something would ruin the mood because they both smelled something foul outside the car. Shortly after this, they would hear a loud scream, described as a, quote, eagle shrieking into a microphone, end quote, off into the wooded area. Randy would scan the area and heard another shriek. He would then turn on his headlights, and they spotted a 7-foot monster staring back at them. It was covered in white hair and mud, and looked sorta like a Bigfoot. Its eyes were glowing red, and it had yellow teeth. The two would flee the area, and actually go to the police. It should be noted here that Judy's father had forbidden Judy from dating Randy, which gives the story a bit of credibility, considering they took the case to the police, causing the story to spread like wildfire, and thus her father finding out. And to the police's credit, they actually went out to look around and found large, narrow footprints, about 3 to 4 inches deep in the mud, and 10 to 12 inches long and 3 inches wide. Law enforcement would also report that they heard a scream coming from the woods, which caused the men to flee back to the patrol car, but they didn't actually see the cryptid. The next day on June 26th, the creature was spotted again. This time, an officer on duty got a call that 2 teenagers were sitting on the back porch when they spotted a tall, white-haired, hairy creature in a field just off the edge of the woods. The police report read, quote, both Randy and Cheryl watched and observed a large creature walk out of the patch of trees near the edge of the yard, and then turn around and walk back into the field. The creature was described as being 7 to 8 feet tall, weighing 300 to 350 pounds, pale dirty white or cream colored, and standing on 2 feet. Creeth stated that he walked toward it and got approximately 30 to 40 feet from it. Creeth also stated that it had a musky odor to it, end quote. While the police were there, a neighbor would come over and say that his 5-year-old son had just spotted something near the edge of the woods 10 minutes prior. The boy claimed that he was out catching fireflies when he seen a huge white shape behind a fence in the yard, causing the young kid to run back inside. The officers would then go to search the area and stated that they smelled a noticeable stench and spotted a slimy film on the tree branches. The police department would take a dog to the scene, who tracked the scent all the way to a barn, but the dog refused to go in. The officers would then go in themselves, but they saw no sign of the creature. About 2 weeks later, a carnival owner living near the banks of the Big Muddy River would report to have seen the tall, hairy creature. which had been bothering the carnival ponies the day before. Many of the carnival workers would confirm that the ponies had been trying to break loose from the trees that they had been tethered to, and allegedly, the cryptid was seen observing the ponies from a nearby hut, though not in an aggressive manner. A few months after that, a local trucker sighted the creature a few miles outside of town, near the Mississippi River. Tracks were left behind and preserved. Allegedly, this was the last sighting, although I was able to find at least one more report from the late 80s. There are also other accounts that state this thing was spotted as far back as the 50s, but again, most people disregard these and all agree that the ones in 1973 are the only legit sightings. It's thought that this was a Bigfoot that was just traveling through the area, which explains why these few sightings are the only ones that ever happened, and why it was last seen at the Mississippi. So what was this thing? The police have stated that they believe the people really seen something. They also stated that the dogs really picked up a scent, leaving many to believe that this was the real deal. This is another one that I'm kinda surprised to find this deep into the iceberg, as I assume everyone has heard of this one. So for that reason, I'm just gonna kinda gloss over it. This is an event in which 9 Soviet hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains between February 1st and 2nd, 1959, under very mysterious circumstances. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, and when the party did not return by the 12th, as they had intended, the relatives demanded a rescue operation. Searchers would go out to find the badly damaged tent on February 26th, and it was covered by snow. The whole thing baffled the searchers. Outside of the tent were 9 sets of footprints left by people wearing socks, one shoe, or even barefoot. They would also find the remains of a small fire near a pine. The first 2 bodies had only underwear, and it appeared that one of the skiers had climbed up into a tree to look for something. Between the campsite and tree line were 3 more corpses, whose body poses indicated that they were attempting to return to the tent. The 3 that were dressed warmer than the others indicated that they had taken clothes off of the dead ones. After the bodies were discovered, an investigation was launched, and it was determined that 6 of the hikers had died from hypothermia, while the other 3 had died from physical trauma. One had skull damage and chest trauma, another had a small crack in the skull. 4 of the victims lie next to a creek. 3 of those 4 had damaged soft tissues of the head and face, while 2 of them were missing eyes and 1 was missing a tongue. And strangely, 1 was missing eyebrows. The fatal injuries to 3 of the bodies were determined to have not been made by humans because the force of the blow had been too strong, and there were some levels of radiation found on at least one of the victims' clothing. This led to a theory later on that the Soviets were testing a secret weapon in the area, and this is what caused their deaths. But to this day, the avalanche theory is most agreed on, as that would account for why they fled so poorly clothed, and then after the avalanche passed, tried to make it back to get their clothes, only to freeze to death on the way. And all of the damage to the bodies was just caused by animals scavenging the corpses. However, skeptics point out that there was no sign of an avalanche, as well as the bodies would have been swept away. Another theory is a katabatic wind, which is just a strong wind that rushes down elevated slopes at hurricane speeds. They are rare and can be extremely violent. It would have made it impossible to stay in the tent, forcing them to abandon and hide in an improvised shelter, which collapsed from the wind, causing the injuries to some of the hikers. After these and the military theory, you get the lesser believed ones, like they were attacked by a local tribe of Mansi people, which is doubtful since there was no tracks left, or an animal attack, but again, there were no tracks. Or there's another one that high winds blew one person away and the others attempted a failed rescue, but that doesn't explain why the tent didn't fly away. And oh yeah, how could I forget? It could have been a Yeti. Another one of the more famous ones to be so far down on this list, Judge Joseph Crater was a New York State Supreme Court justice who mysteriously vanished in 1930 amid a political scandal. In that summer, the first investigations of what would become known as the Seabury Commission would get underway. That commission was formed to look into the corruption in New York City and had just started when Judge Crater and his wife had began their vacation at their summer cabin in Maine. In late July, Crater received a telephone call. He would tell his wife he had to go to New York City to, quote, straightened those fellows out, end quote, but did not elaborate any more on the call. The next day, he would arrive at his apartment, but instead of dealing with those fellows, he instead went to Jersey City to see his mistress, Sarah Ritzie. Crater then returned to Maine on August 1st, before going back to New York on the 3rd. He promised his wife he would be back by the 9th for her birthday. She would report later on that he was in good spirits and acted normally. On the 6th, he would spend 2 hours in his chambers, going through files and destroying several documents. He then had his clerk, Joseph Mara, cash 2 checks for him that amounted to $5,150, or about $84,000 today. They then left together, carrying 2 locked briefcases to Crater's apartment, and he gave Joseph the rest of the day off. Later that evening, he went to a comedy at Belasco Theater, then left and went and had dinner with his mistress Sarah, along with his lawyer friend Warren Klein. He would then leave there, and both Warren and Sarah reported that he walked out to a taxi cab and left. However, for some reason, they would take this back later on and claim that he did not get into a cab. Instead, he walked down the street. Regardless, this was the last official sighting of Crater, but strangely enough, no one noticed he was missing at first. It wasn't until he did not return to Maine after 10 days that his wife started calling around, but no one had seen him. Finally, by the 25th, when he did not report to court, his fellow justices become worried. They would start their own search for Crater, but come up empty-handed. They would finally report it to the police on September 3rd, practically a full month since he was last seen having dinner with Warren and Sarah. An investigation began, and police discovered that the judge's safe deposit box had been emptied, and the 2 briefcases him and Joseph Mara had taken to his apartment were now gone. It was later discovered that Crater had apparently gotten around with several women, and at least one of these was murdered, while another 2 abruptly left town after he vanished. One of these was Sarah Ritzie herself. In October, a grand jury would examine the evidence and came to the conclusion that, quote, "The evidence is insufficient to warrant any expression of opinion as to whether Crater is alive or dead, or as to whether he has absented himself voluntarily, or is the sufferer from disease in the nature of amnesia, or is the victim of crime," end quote. About 6 months after his disappearance, Mrs. Crater, when going through a dresser drawer, would come across some envelopes containing checks, stocks, bonds, and a note. Apparently these items had not been in there when the police searched them previously. This was the last trace of Crater ever found. The theories basically fall into 2 categories, with the most likely being that Crater was killed by a gangster. He had criminal connections, and it's thought he got too deep in with the mob. The second, less likely theory is that Crater, knowing that he was about to be prosecuted in a corruption case, fled with money and started a new life somewhere and was never discovered. On August 18, 1957, at a prehistoric archaeological site in Brooklyn, Maine, known as the Goddard site, a local resident and amateur archaeologist, Guy Milgren, was searching around in what was an old Native American settlement when he came across a peculiar coin. Along with this coin would end up being a treasure trove of artifacts. Nearly 30,000 items of interest would be taken away from the site over a period of years, and just like those other items, there's not really a good record on the coin's actual finding. But what we do know is that it was the second year that Milgren had been digging through the site, and at first, it was thought to be a 12th century British coin. But by 1978, experts from London started to consider the coin may be of Norse origin, and modern technology would eventually prove them right, as it was determined that the coin was no doubt a silver coin minted between 1065 and 1080 AD during Olaf the Peaceful's reign as King of Norway. The coin was widely circulated in the 12th and 13th centuries. The penny also had a hole in it, indicating that it most likely was used as a pendant. The original coin has since crumbled to dust. The Goddard site itself dates back to 1180 to 1235 AD, which is around the time that the penny was being circulated. The people that lived at the site are generally considered to be the ancestors of the Penobscot tribe. The penny, of course, is a mystery, because it was found much further south than Newfoundland, where we know for sure the Vikings made it to. It was also found about 200 years after their exploration voyages. So how did this coin make it to an abandoned Native American site. There's basically a couple of theories on this one. The first one, and the one that really intrigues historians, is that perhaps the Vikings did sail further south than previously thought, and traded this coin with the local natives. However, a couple of things go against this theory. For one, it's the only Viking item recovered at the site, and it's not likely they would have traveled that far and just traded one coin. Secondly, is some of the other artifacts found are from indigenous cultures, such as the door set from far north, indicating the site was most likely just a hub of a large native trading network, and that the penny made it down from Newfoundland as it circulated through this vast Indian trading system. Another likely theory is that it was a hoax. In fact, it was pretty easy to buy Norwegian silver coins and other coins from the time period on the open market in 1957. It's been proposed that Guy Melgren bought the coin himself, planted it there, and then came back later on to find it. Or someone else bought it and planted the coin, and Melgren was duped. And that's been a debate basically since it was discovered, but the most recent conjecture is that the coin was a legit find. If that is indeed true, it would be the only undisputed Viking artifact discovered in America. On November 1st, 1978, a woman named Donna Green was in Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, where she had just given birth to her baby Raymond. When she recovered, she made her way to the nursery window to look at the newborn. While watching from the window, another woman would come up and introduce herself as Lisa Morris. She would tell Donna that she was visiting her sister, who had also just given birth. Donna would eventually go back to her hospital room, and Lisa followed her and sat around and chat. And what would end up being a foreboding sign, Lisa would ask Donna many questions about her and baby Raymond before she would finally leave. Donna would remain in the hospital for 2 more days, until November 3rd, and in that time, Lisa had came back to visit her twice. On the day Donna and Raymond were discharged and were ready to leave, Lisa would ask for a ride home. Donna said yes, and the two left. The driver would drop Donna off first at her apartment, then take Lisa to Stanton Road, where she requested to be dropped off at. Strangely, the driver would state later on that he never seen Lisa enter any of the buildings. And now on top of this, Lisa knew where Donna lived, and 3 days later, Lisa would show up unannounced at Donna's apartment. She told Donna she wanted to see how her and Raymond were, and I can only imagine that the woman was very convincing at being sweet and caring, because I think most parents would be alarmed, but maybe Donna was just naive. She was only 16 at the time. Anyways, Donna let her in, and about an hour after catching up, Donna would decide to go take a shower, and left Raymond with her brother Tony, Raymond's uncle, to tend to him while Lisa remained visiting. It should be noted here too, that Tony was also taking care of his other sister's baby, so he was pretty tired to say the least. About 15 minutes later, Donna would get out of the shower, and immediately realized that both Raymond and Lisa were gone. Tony told his sister he had started nodding off while watching Raymond, and at some point, the newborn started crying, and Lisa picked him up and took him outside in an attempt to get him to stop. Tony thought that Lisa was Donna's friend and that she was okay with it, so he thought nothing of it. Donna would run outside to look for them and did not see them, but luckily a neighbor would tell Donna that she seen Lisa carrying Raymond in a blanket and got into the passenger side of a brown vehicle where a man waited. They would then drive away, and ever since that day, Raymond has never been seen again, nor has the woman. Lisa was described as being 23 to 24 years old at the time, 5'5" to 5'6", and 160 to 170 pounds. She had light brown skin, a small nose, full lips, dark eyes, and a scar on the right side of her face, scars on her temple, and moe on her left cheek. And probably not too surprisingly, that name was fake. Investigators did determine that basically all the information she provided to Donna was made up. None of the newborn mothers at the hospital had a sister named Lisa Morris, and heck, no one in Atlanta even had that name. They couldn't even find anyone that matched the description of the abductor, although Lisa had pointed to a baby in the nursery who had the last name Morris attached and claimed that that was her niece. It wasn't, but that's where she got the name. To make things worse, Atlanta PD would lose Raymond's case file sometime after this and never found it. They had to relaunch an entire new investigation. They would eventually come to a somewhat unexpected conclusion, and that was that the abductors did not kidnap the baby for themselves. Instead, They believe Raymond was sold for adoption outside the United States. How they come to this conclusion, they never said. However, it is far from certain, and no one really knows what happened to baby Raymond. The Marfa Lights are a series of ghost lights that have been spotted near US Route 67 on Mitchell Flat, east of Marfa, Texas. They are famous among paranormal researchers who think the phenomena could be signs of ghost activity or UFOs. They are usually described as distant spots of brightness, yet people are able to distinguish it from ranch lights or car headlights because of the light's movements. The light sometimes appears as mysterious orbs above the desert. They may remain still and pulse on and off, going from dim to almost blinding light, while others have reported to have seen lights that dart across the desert. The colors are usually yellow or orange, but others have been spotted too, such as green, blue, and red. The phenomenon goes back to 1883, when a young man named Robert Ellison saw a flickering light while he was driving cattle through Paisano Pass, and at first thought it might be the campfire of Apache Indians. He would confer with the other settlers, who also stated to have seen the lights. They would go investigate, but they found no signs of any campsite. Between 1945 and 2008, there were at least 34 sightings. One of those in 1976 would be the first one ever photographed and published to be seen by a public audience. Finally, by 2003, monitoring stations were put out to try and capture how many times a year the lights were actually out. They found that an average of 9.5 light sightings a year were detected, spread out over 5 nights a year. The study concluded that it was their belief that the monitoring stations had only detected about half the sightings. As far as what this is, well, I mean, if it's not ghosts or UFOs, the skeptics claim that it's most likely car lights. A group of researchers from the University of Texas at Dallas spent 4 days investigating, and they come to the conclusion that it could be reliably attributed to automobile headlights traveling along US 67. They even had one person take a vehicle out to the highway and flash its headlights, and its appearance was much like that of the Marfa Lights. And how can I forget the good old reliable skeptic claim that it's all swamp gas. On May 6, 1967, in the town of Decatur, Alabama, 34-year-old Mary Faye Hunter left her family home on foot towards a beauty salon where she had an appointment. She did make it and left around 11:30 a.m., where multiple witnesses would then see her at a local grocery store, so it would be somewhat of a surprise to her family when by 1 p.m., Mary still had not returned. As time wore on, worried family members would begin to search for Mary, but they could not find any traces of her. They would then call the police. However, even with the police involved, they did not find her. A $2,000 reward would be posted just 5 days later, looking for information to find her safe return home. Sadly, about 5 months later, on October 14th, a woman fishing in Wheeler Lake would find the skeletal remains of what was later determined to have been Mary. Law enforcement was called, and the coroner came along with scuba gear to fish out the rest of the bones. And oddly, state officials would later claim that Mary had been sexually assaulted right before her death, but declined to say how they knew. And remember, this was the 1960s. The technology to determine that with just skeletal remains seems a little bit odd. But outside of this one clue, police were quickly stumped. In fact, this case went cold pretty quickly. Fast forward to 1969, 40-year-old Juanita Acker was living in a motel in Morgan County. Juanita had been through some bad luck the past couple of years. First, her husband had just passed from cancer nearly 3 years earlier, leaving her with 3 children. And then, just as they were overcoming that loss, the family home would burn down in April of 1969. Now on May 23rd, just a month after, Juanita found her and her 2 teenage daughters in a motel until they could find something more permanent, while her 5-year-old son lived with some of the rest of the family until they could get back on their feet. And on this night, Juanita's oldest daughter had a date, and her 12-year-old daughter had spent the night at a friend's, leaving Juanita alone at the hotel. Juanita would leave a motel key under the doormat for her daughters just in case they lost theirs. A couple hours later, Juanita's oldest daughter, Susan, returned from her date with her boyfriend. As they approached, they noticed the key was left on top of the doormat, which was very unusual. When they opened the door, they found Juanita lying in a blood-soaked bed. Detectives investigated the scene and discovered nothing was missing. They theorized that someone slipped in and shot her while she was asleep. They questioned her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend, plus anyone at the hotel they could find. A motel employee would state that around 11 p.m., the phone line from Juanita's room was connected, and she was on the phone for about 7 minutes. They also found that a family friend had visited her around 10 p.m., but Juanita hadn't died until 11:30. And the most bizarre part, no one heard a gunshot, or at least, no one reported it. And again, the case would go cold. Finally, we moved to January 7th, 1970, when 20-year-old mother of two, Joyce Sanders, would go to help her parents at their general store they owned. At 10:30, she left her parents' store with about $400 in checks, or about $3,000 in today's money, and she cashed the checks in order to bring money back to the store. The bank employees stated that she was alone, but yet when she left, 3 witnesses reported seeing her leaving with a man in a pickup truck. He was described as large and red-headed. Joyce would never make it back to her parents' store. A search would begin, but neither Joyce nor the man were spotted, although an empty money bag was found on a country road later on. By 9 p.m. that night, Joyce's mutilated body was found in the snow, atop a little pile of trash. Her throat had been slashed at least 4 times. There was no sexual assault, but a fierce struggle had taken place. The man was around 5 foot 11 inches and 160 pounds. These cases are connected because they are all unsolved murders of young women who died in a suspicious 4-year period of Morgan County, Alabama. And because of one more sad fact, their case files have all disappeared. The police aren't sure if they were lost with local, county, or state detectives, but they are gone. Because of this, the 3 cases are forever linked. In September of 1978, a man hitchhiking near Boise, Idaho, would accept a ride from a man named Jesse Bishop. He was intending to go to Oregon, but instead decided to go ahead and go to Alaska with Bishop. But when they got to Alaska, they would stop off the Alaska Highway, where a struggle took place, and Bishop would kill the young man. And the following year, the remains would be discovered. Bishop would eventually be apprehended, and claimed that the man told him his name was either John or Jack, and that he was 32 years old at the time. He did have an Oregon driver's license, and also mentioned losing his eye in a logging accident. Bishop also noted that the man smoked, and said that he mentioned having a job at the Lincoln car dealership, washing cars in Colorado or Utah, as well as he claimed to have been married. However, Bishop would tell detectives he was not sure if any of this info was accurate because the man lied a lot. When they asked Bishop why he killed him, he simply said, quote, "He was getting on my nerves," end quote. This mystery doesn't delve a lot into the actual killer, since the mystery is, just who was this man? But I'm gonna guess that there was a lot more to the story than Bishop told us. The man was white, younger than 40, about 6 foot tall, and 185 pounds, with brown curly hair, and was missing his left eye. Near the body lay 2 packs of Winston cigarettes, 3 books of matches, and a broken yellow lead pencil, a green and brown plaid jacket and blue jeans, containing 15 cents in the front right pocket, and a white and orange marble in the front left pocket, which was used as his eye. An eye patch was also found. He has not been identified in 43 years. As far as surprising locations for a runestone to be discovered, Oklahoma has to be near the top of the list, just because of its location alone, way out in south-central US. One would not typically think the Vikings could have ever made it that far, but that's what this next mystery alleges, because there's actually been a few stones recovered there. But the oldest and most famous one is the one we are going to talk about. That is the Heavener runestone, which was discovered in 1923, according to the official record at least, because some accounts state that it was actually discovered a century earlier in the 1830s by a Choctaw hunting party. However, the official record states that it was found near Heavener, Oklahoma, and the characters on the stone belong to the Elder Futhark alphabet, which is the oldest form of runic alphabets, around 2,000 years old, and was a writing system used by the Germanic people. The sandstone slab itself is pretty impressive in size, standing at 10 feet by 12 feet high for nearly a century before it started to attract attention from scholars. The locals just called it Indian rock because they thought the inscriptions had been created by the Choctaw tribe. The inscription reads either Nome Valley or it's someone's personal name, G. Nomadal. Archaeologist Ken Feder has claimed that unlike the runestones found on the east coast of Canada, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence that suggests the Vikings made it to Oklahoma, or even anywhere near the Midwest. And that is the most common view of most archaeologists, as they say it was most likely created by an early Scandinavian immigrant in the 1800s. Some stories specifically say that it was a Swedish man working at a local train depot that was responsible. However, some scholars have left the door open to it being something much older. Henrik Williams, a professor of Nordic languages, said of the stone that it was most likely made in the 19th century, but there was about a 20% chance that it was actually dated back to the 10th or 11th century, and that's been a theory held on to since the 50s, as supporters of this theory claim that an unknown Viking expedition made it deep into the heartland of the US around 600 to 1000 AD, most likely coming up through the Gulf of Mexico and then up the Mississippi River. In fact, just a mile north and a mile south of Heavener lies two more runestones. Supporters of the theory claim it's not as crazy as it sounds, as they cite other runestones that have been found, such as the Kensington runestone found in Minnesota. Oklahoma itself has the most stones found out of every state in the US, with a total of 6. Local historian Gloria Farley claimed that starting at Newfoundland, a Viking expedition could have easily sailed down the North American eastern seaboard, swung around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, and entered the Mississippi, before finally branching off onto the Arkansas River, then the Poto River in Oklahoma. Many disagree, of course, and that has led to all kinds of speculation. Some think it was made by a person living there during the French colonization period of the 18th century. Some even claim that a member from the 1667 expedition of the famous French explorer René Robert Cavelier as being the one responsible. Although it's not likely to be solved anytime soon, one thing is for certain: it's one of the most intriguing runestones out there. Thousands of people from across the world go there every year just to see it, including some of the most respected scholars in Europe. Asha Degree was a 9-year-old girl who went missing from Shelby, North Carolina on February 14th, 2000. It is a bizarre case because she packed her own book bag and left on her own accord. She would leave sometime in the early morning hours, sometime after 2:30 a.m., despite the heavy rain and wind the area was seeing that night. Several motorists spotted her. One, a truck driver, even turned around and came back to check on her, at which point she was 1.3 miles away from her home. It was between 3:45 and 4:15 a.m. at this time, and when the driver got closer, she ran off into the woods. It would not be until the next morning her parents realized she was gone. An intensive search would begin later that day, and they found some of the items she had been carrying when she was last spotted. A year and a half later, her book bag was dug up at a construction site along Highway 18, just north of Shelby. The bag was still packed and was in a plastic bag. Strangely enough, the bag now contained items that did not belong to Asha, and although it seems like she ran away from home, detectives could not find any reason why she would have done so, as she was younger than the typical age that kids tend to run away at. This has led most investigators to state that it was their belief she was abducted. What's not clear is if it was a planned abduction, which is why Asha left her home early that morning to begin with, or if she left for her own reason and was abducted by someone that happened to drive by. The latter seems to be less likely, since this was 4 a.m. in a rural area of North Carolina. There's also the possibility that she got lost and succumbed to the elements and her body just hasn't been found yet. The only real lead came in 2016 when the FBI disclosed that Asha may have been seen getting into a dark green, early 70s model Lincoln Continental Mark IV, or a Ford Thunderbird along Route 18 near where she was seen that night. But considering that lead came 16 years after the disappearance, it's hard to determine how credible the witness account is. As of today, the case remains unsolved. There are no suspects either, at least none that have been publicly named. On October 10th, 2016, Christine Wagner would leave her residence in Olympia, Washington. The 67-year-old was last seen getting into her 2004 Toyota Matrix and driving off. This was the last time she would ever be heard from. Family and friends have no idea where her destination was. They would call authorities pretty quickly, as they worried due to Wagner's previous attempts at self-harm. Inside her home, detectives would find her purse with all its contents left behind. Further complicating matters is the fact that Christine, or someone else, turned her phone off after she disappeared. Her car would be found 2 weeks later at Harmony Farm Conservation Easement on Johnson Point Road in Olympia. This is one of the most obscure missing person cases we have ever came across, because what I just told you is literally all that's known about the case, at least publicly anyways. I wish there was more info available to share, but there's just not. But even though there's been nothing stated publicly, the most likely scenario is Christine either chose to disappear or chose to end her life. The Great Library of Alexandria was one of the largest and most significant libraries to ever exist. It was part of a larger research institution called the Mausean, which was dedicated to the goddess of literature, science, and arts. The Universal Library was most likely proposed by Demetrius of Phalerum, an exiled Athenian statesman living in Alexandria, but the library itself was not constructed until Ptolemy II of Philadelphus. The library would quickly acquire many papyrus scrolls, mainly due to the Ptolemaic king's aggressive nature at procuring various texts. Contrary to popular belief, the Library of Alexandria did not burn down. Instead, it declined gradually over the course of several centuries. There were also rulers who would purge intellectuals, prompting many responsible for the library to flee to other nations. Part of the library did accidentally get burned down by Julius Caesar during the Roman Civil War, but it's unclear how much damage was done. The library further dwindled down during Roman control, as there wasn't much funding or support for it. The library was thought to have been fully destroyed at the latest by 270 AD, but the mystery here is just what knowledge was stored at the library. What was lost? Unfortunately, there's no real way to know. It's not even known how many different scrolls were stored at the library, but there's a rough estimate that it was between 40,000 to 400,000 at its peak, or about the equivalent to 100,000 books, which would have taken an enormous amount of storage space. Making it even more difficult to guess was the fact that one piece of writing could take multiple scrolls. These would be broken down into self-contained books by an editor. There was an index created by Callimachus, who was one of the librarians. The catalog was created around 306 BC, but since few fragments exist, it's impossible to take anything from it. We do know his system broke the scrolls down into 6 genres and 5 sections, that being rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics, natural science, and miscellaneous. But how much of it was really lost? One interesting thing to remember in all this, it was not the only library in ancient times. There were many. There were so many that anything of note that was lost from the Library of Alexandria would have been stored elsewhere. So in all likelihood, nothing of real value was lost. What was lost, however, would have been the commentaries by the 100 or so researchers and librarians that lived at the library full-time. Their thoughts on the authors, books, as well as their catalogs, such as the aforementioned index by Callimachus, would all be lost. Regardless, whatever was lost will likely never be recovered. The Doodler, aka the Black Doodler, was an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for at least 6, but up to 16 deaths in San Francisco, California between January 1974 and September 1975. The nickname came about because the suspect would make sketches of the men after he met them at the bar or club, then convinced them to leave with him. It's here that they would have a sexual encounter before the Doodler would stab them to death. His victims were often stabbed in similar locations on the body. All of the victims were white. Detectives believe the men were killed near the location where they were found. The suspect was a black man between 19 and 25 years old. He was about 6 foot and slender build. The confirmed victims are as follows. Gerald Kavanagh was the first victim, 49 years old, and found on the beach in the early morning hours. He had self-defense wounds. 27-year-old Joseph Stevens, found near a lake. Klaus Christmann was a German immigrant. His case, unlike the others, was a little bit different. He was found clothed, and his murder was far more brutal than the others. While he was also married and had children, Warren Andrews was only recently identified in January 2022. He was 52 years old. Frederick Kappen, who was 32 and died from multiple stab wounds. His body was one of the only ones moved from the murder spot. He was a Vietnam vet. And finally, Harold Goldberg, a 66-year-old Swedish immigrant found in Lincoln Park. He was slightly different, as he was well out of the age range of the serial killer. He is believed to be the last official victim of the doodler. Detectives are almost certain they know who is behind the killings. This man was described as a mental patient with a history of sex-related problems. His psychiatrist had even told investigators that the suspect had admitted to the brutal slayings during one session. There's also the fact that they were tipped off to the suspect's license plate. Luckily, in 3 of the attacks, the victims survived. They could have been witnesses, but these men refused to testify in court because they did not want to come out publicly. One of the survivors was a well-known entertainer. The other was a diplomat, making the likelihood that they will ever speak out as really small. The suspect did cooperate with police in interviews, but never confessed. He has never been named publicly, and even though police have a ton of circumstantial evidence, they would need one of the survivors to come forward and testify, which isn't likely. The reward for information leading to the arrest is now $200,000. April 30th, 1932. Stockholm, Sweden. A prostitute named Lily Lindstrom, who was 32 years old at the time, went to pay her rent before going back to her apartment. The district she lived in was known as Atlas, and the apartment was particularly small, with 1 to 2 rooms and a kitchen, and very dark. She had moved here just recently, after her marriage failed, and she left her husband and moved to the city to start a new life. Her downstairs neighbor, Minnie Jansen, was also a sex worker, and was Lily's closest friend. Lily was spending the evening with Minnie, and they were deciding what clothes to wear for an evening party when the phone rang. Lily answered it, and found it strange that she didn't recognize the man's voice, as strangers didn't typically call her, but her and Minnie, who was listening in, said the man sounded like a gentleman, and Lily agreed to meet him. It should be noted here that Lily was one of the only sex workers that had a telephone in the entire city, as home phones were not commonplace. The stranger stated he was just around the corner from Lily's apartment and would head that way as soon as the phone call ended. Minnie left and went back downstairs to her apartment, but Minnie would actually see Lily 2 more times that evening as she came down in search of condoms, which was something she did occasionally. Minnie would go back to check on her friend around 9 that night, as they were supposed to go to the party. However, Lily did not answer the door. This did not alarm her though, as she thought Lily might be out celebrating Walpurgis night with her client instead, so she would go back the next morning and knock on the door again. Still, there was no answer. She was still not alarmed at this point, however, but after 3 more days with no reply, on May 4th, Minnie would go to the Stockholm police. They would go do a welfare check on the young woman. When they were able to get into her room, they found a shocking scene. Lily was face down on her bed. She was naked, and her clothes were folded neatly on a chair next to the body. She had been dead for 2 to 3 days, and it appeared she had been engaged in sexual activity right before being murdered. The cause of death had been repeated blows from a blunt object to Lily's head. The doctor performing the autopsy assumed it was most likely a pipe, and that he had hit her from behind. Now, sadly, murders of prostitutes aren't exactly rare, but this one sticks out for one particularly bizarre reason. An autopsy would reveal that most, if not all of Lily's blood had been drained. A further search would reveal a blood-stained gravy ladle in the kitchen sink, which police feared the perp had used to drink her blood. In addition, they found a bloody towel in the apartment that looked as if someone had wiped a blood-soaked mouth with it, and finally, they found saliva on her neck. After this, the unknown man would become known as the Atlas Vampire. Since this was the days before DNA evidence, there was not much investigators could do, despite the amount of bodily fluids left at the scene. But they would start to go question some of Lily's regular clients, and nothing came of it, and no one was ever charged. There were no lead suspects, and detectives were never able to figure out where all the blood had even went. One of the more widely held theories later on was that it was possibly someone affiliated with law enforcement, which is why the perpetrator was so keen on making sure there were no empty glasses, cigarette butts, or any other object that could have contained his fingerprints. He did not have to worry about saliva or semen, as this is way before DNA. It could also explain the blood-covered ladle and towel, which, assuming he was an officer, left the items to confuse his colleagues. Others speculated that it was her ex-husband, who was mad that she had left him, went to find her, only to find out she was now a sex worker, and killed her in the heat of the moment. Yet, that doesn't explain the blood draining. Another theory, looked at right from the beginning, was this was just a year after one of the most famous movies in history debuted, that being Dracula. It's thought that with the vampire lore experiencing such a cultural boom, that some mentally unstable person really wanted to experience being a vampire and drinking blood. And of course, the less likely theory, maybe it was a real vampire. This would explain why the man was never seen entering or exiting the building. In spite of being in a pretty heavily congested area, maybe he simply turned into a bat and flew away. In 1848, Quartermaster Major Henry Wayne would go to the War Department with a peculiar suggestion. He wanted the Secretary of War to consider importing camels to the Southwest Territory, which was greatly expanding. Now, this wasn't the first time this was proposed. As far back as 1836, Major George G. Crossman would also recommend to Congress that the Army should use camels for the problems of crossing the desert. It was thought that camels could be used to carry at least twice the amount of weight as horses and mules. It was also suggested the camels could carry mail and that the first camel passenger trains could be developed to run from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. And by 1854, the Senate passed a bill that allowed $30,000 for the camel experiment. However, though the camels were well suited for travel in the Southwest, they were terribly unpopular with the soldiers. The camels had a habit of frightening smaller livestock. They were giant, goofy, and smelly. They also had a tendency to wander off during the nights. The Army would use the camels until the Civil War broke out 3 years later, and here's where the story kinda deviates. Some camels were supposedly released during a battle as a distraction. Others would be sold, while others were just straight up released into the desert. Whatever the case, the Army was done with the camel experiment. Though the Camel Corps was abandoned, they would roam for decades, but they were not limited to this area, as sightings stretched from Iowa to California, even far as north as British Columbia, and this would lead to a number of legends and tales about the camels. The most famous is the camel known simply as the Red Ghost. In 1941, in Douglas, Texas, the last official sighting would occur when the entire body of a camel was witnessed at a relatively close range. The sightings were still sporadic in the 60s and would occur all the way up to the early 2000s, particularly in the 80s, when a series of highly credible sightings took place in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas. Sightings are generally made by witnesses who are traveling down roads that run through desert areas when they happen to catch a glimpse of what appears to be a camel calmly strolling off in the distance. Other times, they come from those exploring the desert on foot. There's also reports that have been made by those who have spent the day hiking, treasure hunting, or exploring areas around one of the abandoned mines in the American Southwest. And now for the mystery. It's been decades since the last real Army camel died, but stories about the camels trekking along the southwestern deserts persist. So what are the people seeing? Are they really ghosts? Or could there be camels that somehow survived and reproduced and are still traveling the desert? Or are they just mirages? Or maybe just people telling tales to keep the legend alive? On February 19th, 1994, around 8:15 p.m., a woman named Gloria Rameriz would be brought into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital by paramedics. She was suffering from severe heart palpitations and an abnormal pattern of breathing. The medical staff would try and sedate her, but Gloria was responding poorly to the treatment, so the staff tried to defibrillate her heart. Once that was done, several people saw a weird oily appearance covering Ramirez's body, and they noticed a fruity garlic-like odor that they first thought was coming from her mouth. RN Susan Kane would draw blood from Gloria's arm and notice an ammonia-like smell in the tube. There was also manila-colored crystals floating in her blood. At one point, Kane fainted and was removed from the room. The medical resident, Julie Gorchinski, would begin to feel nauseated and lightheaded and had to leave the trauma room. She would also end up fainting. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist who was assisting in the trauma room, would be the third to faint before the staff then ordered everyone to evacuate all emergency department patients outside to the parking lot. A skeleton crew stayed behind to stabilize Ramirez. However, she was pronounced dead about 45 minutes later from complications related to cervical cancer. Overall, 23 of the 37 staff become ill, and 5 were hospitalized. The most seriously ill, Julie Gorchinski, was in intensive care for 2 weeks, contracting apnea, hepatitis, pancreatitis, and necrosis of the bone marrow, which crippled her legs for months and required 3 surgeries. A hazmat team would search the hospital for every toxic substance you can think of, but found nothing. The woman dubbed as the Toxic Lady was not toxic at all. So just what happened in that emergency room? Doctors stated that Gloria died from complications of cervical cancer, as she had been in the late stages prior to this. But why was her body toxic to the medical team? There are 2 main theories surrounding this. Initially, the incident was written off as a mass hysteria event, but this has been, for the most part, discredited. Soon another theory was brought about that gained a lot of traction. It was speculated that Gloria had been using DMSO, a chemical solvent that is used to reduce inflammation and pain. It was thought that she had used so much that when the medical team used a defibrillator, it converted the solvent to dimethyl sulfate, which is extremely poisonous. This would also explain the garlic smell the team spoke of. However, other scientists have said this would be impossible. Henry Hudson was an English explorer in the early 17th century, known mostly for his vast exploration of Canada and parts of the northeastern United States, but he is probably known more for his disappearance. In 1607 and 1608, Hudson made 2 attempts on behalf of English merchants to find the rumored northeastern passage to China via a route in the Arctic Circle. Later, in 1609, he would land in modern-day New York metro area and explore the region on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. By now, Hudson's fame had grown quite a bit, and in 1610, the English came calling again, and for the second time, they asked him to find a northern route to China. A little over a month later, on August 2nd, the ship would enter Hudson Bay. Excitement among the crew was very high, due to the expectation they had just discovered the Northwest Passage. Hudson would spend the following months mapping and exploring the eastern shores, but was never able to find a passage. In November, the ship would become trapped in ice, leading the crew to move ashore for the winter. When the ice cleared in the spring of 1611, Hudson made plans to move further west to look for the passage. By this time, though, the crew was fed up and insisted to go home. Hudson declined, and things would come to a head. Eventually, a mutiny would occur that June, and since the mutiny was successful and Hudson was never found, the story is very one-sided, so no one is for sure what exactly happened. According to the best known account, the ship's navigator, Abakuk Prickett, yes, that was his real name, tells how they set Hudson, his son, and 7 crewmen, men who were either sick or loyal to Hudson, adrift in a small open boat, effectively marooning them in Hudson Bay. They left them with clothing, powder and shot, pikes, an iron pot, some food, and other miscellaneous items. However, Prickett's account has always been doubted, as he blamed the alleged leaders of the uprising on 2 men who had been good and loyal friends to Hudson for years. These men, unsurprisingly, did not survive the trip back to Europe and were unable to dispute the accusation. Neither were the mutineers ever punished, most likely because of the knowledge they had acquired traveling to the New World. But this leaves the question, what exactly happened to Hudson? One often overlooked fact in this story is that when the mutineers returned, it was noted that there was blood on the ship deck, meaning the most likely scenario is Hudson and the men that remained loyal to him were killed and never let off the boat to begin with, and it's not likely the mutineers would have ever shared their dwindling supplies anyways. Other possible theories are the men made it to land and were either killed by or joined the Cree, or possibly built a structure and waited for a rescue that never showed. On August 25th, 2006, at around 9 p.m., Stephanie Stewart would call a family member for her nightly chat. Stephanie, who was a very active 70-year-old, worked as a seasonal wildfire spotter for the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. She was stationed at the Athabasca Tower, which is located 15 miles northeast of Hinton, Alberta, on the outskirts of Jasper National Park. Since fire spotters are alone for several hours in some of the most desolate areas, they are often required to do call-ins. This particular park had a routine check-in system that was required 3 times a day, with the first check-in at 9 a.m. That morning, however, Stephanie did not check in. Her supervisor would call her several times, but the call would always be picked up with no answer before the person on the other end would calmly hang up. The supervisor's concern would begin to grow because Stephanie had never missed a call in all her years of working there. He immediately decided to go to the tower to check on her. Upon arriving, he spotted her truck. Feeling a little bit more relieved, he opened the door. He would report seeing an unattended pot of water boiling on the stove, as well as the phone cord that had been unplugged from the jack. Worst of all was there was no sign of Stephanie. He urgently called authorities. The RCMP would be on scene soon, along with emergency personnel, who at first believed it was an animal attack due to some fur and scat that was found in the area. But after a conservation officer with Alberta Fish and Wildlife inspected the scene, he quickly ruled out an animal attack. RCMP's Major Crimes Unit would examine the scene in the cabin. They would rule out any medical event that may have confused Stephanie, causing her to get lost. They would say it was foul play, as they thought she had been murdered. But how did the RCMP come to this conclusion? Well, in addition to the pot of boiling water, police would notice a smear of blood on the steps leading up to the tower, and inside, they would discover a few things missing, mainly from the bed, which was 2 pillows with blue covers, a burgundy sheet, and a Navajo pattern duvet. In addition, Stephanie's gold watch, which they were unsure if she had been wearing it at the time of the incident or if it had been laying out somewhere. Stephanie was an experienced outdoors woman who had spent 13 years working at that tower. It was highly unlikely that she just wandered off the trail and got lost. They would eventually do an extensive ground, water, and air search though. They even used infrared technology and nothing turned up. The RCMP has stated there was forensic evidence at the scene. However, they declined to go into specifics to protect the integrity of the investigation. And in regards to that smear of blood that investigators have reported, well, there's been unofficial chatter about that. Although there was a small smear of blood on the steps, according to unofficial reports, there was a significant amount of blood in the tower. This was no doubt spotted by her supervisor, and he was probably the leaker, as the RCMP have never released any details about the actual crime scene. The going thought seemed to be that she was later wrapped up in the bedding and taken out and hid somewhere. But with the massive search effort that was made by the search and rescue, there was no evidence found of that. How could someone pull off such a crime against a victim so far off the beaten path? Well, there's actually a simple explanation for that. It turns out that Stephanie wasn't that far from civilization. Actually, the Athabasca Tower only sits 3 miles off the main road, and there was no locked gate, meaning anyone could have drove to the isolated tower and cabin. Adding to this perplexing question was the timing. Investigators had 2 viable theories. The first was that someone showed up at night, most likely after her 9 p.m. phone call to her family member, and then spent the night with her. Whether she wanted him to stay or not is left up for debate. Or, the most likely theory, according to investigators, someone showed up a few moments before her scheduled check-in to supervisors at 9 a.m. The reason for this mainly comes down to that pot of boiling water on the stove. Detectives believe someone showed up while she was making tea or coffee, murdered Stephanie, and then possibly decided to rummage through the cabin when the phone calls started coming in from her supervisor, which panicked him and he had to leave. Or maybe there was a different reason. Maybe it wasn't a botched robbery, although that watch has never been found. Regardless, the supervisor would have showed up minutes after the assailant left. But who could do this and why? Investigators could not find any known enemies of Stephanie, and they believed it was most likely a chance encounter. There's never been anyone named as a suspect in the case, but there has been one key person of interest among online sleuths. That is a man named Travis Vader. Vader, who is already serving a life sentence for the murder of Lyle and Marie McCann, who were both in their late 70s, was actually in the area at the time of Stephanie's disappearance. He is a drug addict with a history of arson, theft, and weapon charges. He actually killed the McCanns during a robbery west of Edmonton 4 years after Stephanie's disappearance and disposed of their bodies in the woods. and those bodies have never been found. But there's nothing to link him to the crime other than the fact that he was in the general area at the time. As far as how and why, theories diverge. One of the more prominent theories is that a burglar, perhaps Vader, thought the old cabin attached to the watchtower would be abandoned, allowing him a quick, easy score to go buy more drugs. And when he got there, he was surprised by Stephanie, whom he then murdered and stole her watch. And before getting to ransack the place, the phone calls started coming in. He quickly wrapped her up in a blanket, took her outside to his vehicle, and sped off. Another theory sort of related is it's possible two people met to do a drug deal on the uninhabited back road, only to be interrupted by Stephanie, causing them to panic and try to silence her. After those two theories, it's really up in the air. Although she has never been found, there is one positive that came from this. The provincial government would add a new safety feature to its 127 lookouts. This included lookouts with locked gates at the road access, cabin with reinforced new locks, steel doors, and shatterproof glass. Brush was also cleared, giving an increased line of sight, along with staffers wearing radios, personal locator beacons, and panic buttons. The fire watchers now check in more frequently and are given covert radio codes that can be used discreetly to indicate they are in distress. April 6th, 1987. 13-year-old child prodigy David Guerrero Guevara was scheduled to go to the local Les Maisons art gallery. It was that night they intended to show off the young artist's work, entitled El Cristo de la Buena Muerte. It was also the first time he would be interviewed by a radio station. It was said other artists were impressed at the level of detail David was able to do in such a short amount of time. David would leave his home about 6:30 p.m. that evening to get on the local bus and head to the art gallery. Sadly, this would be the last time David was ever seen. At around 3 p.m., David's father would go to the art gallery to pick him up. It was then that he discovered David never made it. He went straight to the police. A massive search would start, but they could not find him. They would then question David's family and friends, whom they cleared pretty quick. The police would start their investigation, but there were no clues left, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Police were able to figure out that David never got on the bus though, which is extremely odd since it was only a few minutes from his home. It would be reported a few times later on that he was spotted in Lisbon, once with two other boys of the same age, while a Spanish couple on their honeymoon stated he was in Lisbon painting at the town square. He was also spotted on a train in Lisbon. Investigators would initially believe he ran away to pursue a life as a bohemian artist, perhaps after contacting someone in Portugal who agreed to be his sponsor. He had actually been on a school trip to Portugal a few months prior to his disappearance, but they would eventually abandon this line of thinking, as they were able to verify the sightings were just a case of mistaken identity. Spanish authorities were left with little to go on, but they would form a pretty solid theory as to what happened. It's believed a criminal network of art forgers discovered David, and when seeing his talent, knew they could use his abilities as an extremely gifted painter to produce some very convincing forgeries. It was decided that he was kidnapped. But there was a problem with this theory. Actually, there was two problems. One, there was no sign of a struggle. There were no reports of an abduction. With only 500 feet between the bus stop and David's home, someone was bound to have heard the commotion of a kidnapping. Secondly, Queen Sofia was actually visiting Malaga that afternoon, and she was very close to David's home. Because of this, there was a very high police presence. Both uniform and plainclothes officers lined the street. It would have been near impossible to kidnap anyone. This led law enforcement to drop the abduction theory. Police were now confident that David went on his own will, but to where and why? David had a good home life and loved his family. It didn't make sense that he would run away. Some possible answers would eventually come along when 3 years later, a woman would come forward and report a connection between David and a man at a hotel. Some accounts say she seen David meeting the man at the hotel. Others just say she remembered a napkin in the man's room that said, David Guerrero Whaling. Whaling being an area of Malaga City. Police would search the hotel records and find that a 70-year-old man stayed there that year between March and April, the time that David had vanished. What made this more alarming was in the earliest part of the investigation, police would ask friends and pupils in David's art class where he might be, and for them to show any artwork they had of his. His friend would hand over a caricature of an old man that the boy had made just a few days before he vanished. The police were able to compare the drawing with a picture of the man, and it looked suspiciously like him, but obviously at this point, the man had gone back to Switzerland. Spain would work with Switzerland's law enforcement in hopes of finding the man, only to discover he had already passed away. His wife, however, was still alive and let police search her late husband's photo lab. There were plenty images of Malaga, but none of David. In fact, police could find no connection whatsoever between the painter and the man. David's family, for their part, would back this, as they stated they believed the man in the drawing is a random person and not connected to the Swiss man in any way. And considering this woman waited 3 years to bring this up, well, it certainly pointed to a red herring. This whole case is bizarre, and there was never much evidence to draw from, so we're left with a few theories. Abduction is almost undoubtedly ruled out. Running away is very unlikely, as almost every sighting has been ruled out. Not to mention, he had no reason to leave home. So we're left with one key fact of all this. It's almost guaranteed David went voluntarily with someone else, and his fate after that is uncertain. Some speculate that someone David trusted at art school was paid to lure David into the waiting vehicle where he was assaulted and perhaps worse, possibly even by the old wealthy Swiss man. Others contend a criminal network tricked him into going with them where they were able to make use of his abilities, although that one is admittedly a stretch. Finally, others contend that David, who was running behind on his way to the art gallery, was approached by someone in a car offering him a ride, perhaps someone he knew, or maybe a complete stranger, and David, who was anxious to get to the gallery and do his first radio interview, skipped the loaded bus and decided to go with the stranger in the car. Amy Lynn Bradley was an American woman who went missing during a Caribbean cruise on Royal Caribbean International ship Rhapsody of the Seasons in March 1998 at the age of 23. Around 3:40 a.m. on March 23rd, records show that Amy would return to her cabin shortly after her brother after a night of dancing. They would speak before going to bed. Amy's father would awake sometime between 5:15 and 5:30 a.m. to see Amy on the balcony. However, when he awoke again, just 30 minutes later at 6 a.m., he did not see her. He would search all the common areas of the ship and would not find her. He would then return to his room and alert his wife and son. Amy's family would in turn report to the crew that she was missing at roughly 6:30 a.m. However, the crew would refuse to make an announcement until 7:50 a.m. after allowing the majority of passengers to disembark. Authorities, though, would be alerted, and the Netherlands Antilles Coast Guard would do a 4-day search in the surrounding waters, but could find no sign of Amy. They would speculate that she had fell overboard and drowned. However, Amy was an excellent swimmer and former lifeguard, and there was no proof that she had fell overboard. After the cruise line reluctantly searched the ship, the family would search the island with no luck. They would eventually contact the FBI, who would fly in the next day. The FBI, however, could not find her either. However, they did suspect foul play. In the years that would pass, numerous sightings of Amy would be reported. However, none have been confirmed or led to any real proof of anything. But there has been speculation that she was trafficked. Evidence for this comes mainly from one key eyewitness from a U.S. Navy officer. He would claim he had visited a brothel and a girl would come up and tell him her name was Amy Bradley and that she begged him for help, stating that she was being held against her will. He did not help her though, or report the incident, as he was in fear he would be disciplined by the Navy for visiting a brothel. The other key piece of evidence was in 2005 when a photo was emailed to Amy's family, purportedly showing Amy in an escort ad. The woman in question does bear a strong resemblance to Amy. However, one has to wonder why an ad would be posted online for a now famous missing woman that the FBI was currently looking for. It just doesn't make sense. However, a couple of forensic analysts have said that the pictures are 100% Amy. Finally, were all the inconsistencies of witnesses the night of the disappearance. In particular, the staff and band members that were questioned. One band member in question, a bassist nicknamed Yellow, would become the center of attention for a while, but no solid proof has ever linked him to her disappearance. In addition, photos of the Bradleys were taken, along with all the other passengers, and sold on board. Her father discovered every picture featuring Amy was missing. The photographer had remembered printing out Amy's pictures, but did not know what had happened to them. So the possibility that Amy in some way met foul play with a staff member of the cruise line and thrown overboard has been speculated about. But there's also many investigators who state that Amy most likely just fell overboard. This is the most simple explanation. A few too many drinks or falling awkwardly could make a person's excellent swimming skills useless. On March 10th, 1976, a man would report to the police that his neighbor, Bradford Bishop, and his family had not been seen in some time. A detective sent to the home would find blood on the front porch of the Bishop residence as well as on the floor and walls of the front hall and bedrooms. This would start an intense search for the Bishop family. Making things more worrisome was the fact that Bradford served in the Foreign Service for the U.S. State Department. An investigation would be launched. They would find that Bradford had left his office in D.C. March 1st after complaining to his secretary that he did not feel well. He would then go get several $100s from the bank, go to the mall where he would buy a sledgehammer and a gas can. He filled that gas can and the tank on his 1974 station wagon. He would leave there, go buy a shovel and pitchfork. Bishop would then return home between 7:30 and 8 p.m. It's believed then that he killed his wife, followed by his mother, and finally his 3 sons. Bishop would then drive the bodies 275 miles to a densely wooded swamp south of Columbia, North Carolina. The following day, he would dig a shallow hole where he piled the bodies and set them ablaze. By March 18th, investigators would locate the station wagon in Elkmont, Tennessee, about 400 miles from the site where he buried his family, and just a couple of miles from the Appalachian Trail. Upon searching the car, they would find dog biscuits, a bloody blanket, shotgun, axe, shaving kit, and Bishop's medicine. A witness placed the car there between March 5th and 7th. Police believed he joined the constant flow of hikers on the Appalachian Trail as means to escape. Police would use bloodhounds, but could not pick up his scent. Detectives then looked for motives, but couldn't really find any. He had a history of depression, though. He had also been turned down for a promotion the day that he had left the office, fueling speculation that maybe that pushed him over the edge. Some people have also said that he might have viewed his wife as being the reason for his tension, as he had wanted to take a job with the Foreign Service overseas. However, his wife was pursuing her own career and did not want to move to be a housewife like Bradford wanted her to be. Bishop also had a diplomatic passport, which he could have traveled on, and with a 1-week head start on authorities, he could have easily gotten out of the country. Numerous sightings have placed him in Italy, Belgium, England, Finland, the Netherlands, Germany, Greece, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. However, by 2014, authorities would state they believe he is now residing in the U.S., possibly California, and he managed to stay off the radar by just keeping a low profile. And despite being in his mid-80s, law enforcement believes he is still alive. In 1981, a body of a young woman would be found in Miami County, Ohio. After it was determined the victim had died from strangulation and receiving a head injury beforehand, the victim would be identified in 2018 as Marsha King. However, in the timeline between 1981 and 2018, an additional 8, and possibly more, victims would be killed in a similar way. The killer almost always had the same MO, which was to beat and strangle the victim, and usually leave the victim to be found with her underwear and shoes missing. Sometimes, all the clothes would be missing. Eventually, in 1986, a lead would develop. The body of a 23-year-old prostitute, Shirley Dean Taylor, would be discovered. Before her disappearance, however, she had been seen at a Union 76 truck stop. According to witnesses that she had spoken to, she had mentioned she was going to see a regular named Dr. No. This would be the last time she was seen alive. A year later, in 1987, another lead would come about. A 27-year-old, Anne Marie Patterson, would be arrested for prostitution. She would bring up a sketchy client named Dr. No. She would go on to describe that he was extremely negative and was just hard to deal with. She would also describe what he was driving and his appearance. A week later, though, Patterson would disappear. Witnesses would report that the night she vanished, Dr. No had been looking on CB for a girl to pick up. Her body would be found 40 days later and 250 miles away in Austintown, near Cincinnati. At this point, detectives obviously knew he was a truck driver, but they still had no idea who the man was. 2 more victims would perish in 1987, but at least 1 more witness would see and report the truck. Between 1988 and 1990, 2 more victims would be discovered. During the course of the investigation, detectives would interview hundreds of prostitutes, pimps, service station employees, and truck drivers. The man was described as a tall, large man with fair skin and dark hair, between 25 and 40, wore glasses, and had a northeastern accent. Finally, in 2019, 49-year-old Samuel Legg would be arrested in Arizona. Authorities, using DNA profiling, were able to prove his guilt in at least 4 murders in Ohio and Illinois. They would link his first murder back to 1989, when Legg was only 20, meaning that the murders in 1981 could not have been him, since he was only 11 years old and not driving. He was also suspected of killing his stepdaughter in the early 90s, but law enforcement could never definitively link him to the case. So even if we concede that Legg was truck driving at 18, which most would say was very unlikely, that would put him responsible for the 3 1987 murders. However, 4 of the murders preceding that year, and 1 attempted murder, would almost certainly not be Legg. So who was it? Alright guys, we have spent about 3 hours looking back at some of the best mysteries we have covered in the past year. But mysteries aren't the only thing we looked at on this channel. We looked at our fair share of conspiracies, and really, what kind of compilation would be complete without some conspiracies? So I want to start with James Garfield was purposely killed by his doctors. James Garfield was the 20th President of the United States and served a very short tenure of 6 months. 2 of those months, he lay in a hospital bed, slowly succumbing to a gunshot wound. After his assassin, Charles J. Guiteau, shot him at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. Guiteau, who may have had a mental illness, falsely believed he played a major role in Garfield getting elected. He felt he should have been rewarded a consulship, and so he applied for one to serve in Vienna and Paris. His application was rejected by the Garfield administration, and it deeply offended Guiteau, who would then try to assassinate Garfield. However, it's been widely attested to by modern doctors that the shot in the back would have been easily survivable, and what really killed Garfield was the doctors poking and probing the wound with unwashed hands and non-sterilized instruments. Guiteau would even say at his trial, "Yeah, I shot the president, but the doctors killed him." And this is where the conspiracy comes in. Did the doctors purposely kill Garfield? The head doctor treating Garfield was a man named Dr. Willard Bliss. And let me point out, his real name was Doctor. That was not his title. His parents actually named him Doctor, and maybe this had something to do with his ego, as he would later go on to become a real doctor, as he would continually insist that he was in charge of Garfield's recovery, in spite of the fact that he was mostly wrong on everything. There was even an account where Alexander Graham Bell brought in his newly devised metal detector, made specifically to save the president, to try and locate the bullet inside Garfield's body. Bliss would only let Bell scan his right side because that's where he was convinced the bullet was. Not surprisingly, Dr. Bliss was wrong, but his ego couldn't allow Bell to locate the bullet elsewhere. And not only was Bliss about a foot off from where the bullet was really located, he would discover it was safely encased in his abdomen and would likely not have killed the president. Bliss was also shocked at the amount of septic infection inside the president's body. Bliss was a man that was lucky to live before the internet, because his career would have been ruined much sooner, and he wouldn't have had a chance to even work with the president. Early on in the Civil War, he was known to have fled the battlefield and left wounded soldiers to die instead of treating them, because of his own cowardice. He would be appointed the superintendent of a veterans hospital by Lincoln later on. Lincoln would then be treated at that same hospital the night he was shot. And in spite of Bliss being the boss of every doctor in the hospital, and being a so-called ballistic trauma expert, he was pushed to the side by more qualified doctors and watched history unfold from the sideline. It was probably this reason he was so insistent on being the one in charge during the Garfield ordeal. Bliss also was hesitant to believe this new movement in medicine proposed by a man named Dr. Joseph Lister. You know, the guy they named Listerine after. He proposed that in every surgery, every piece of equipment should be sterilized, along with the hands being super clean before touching the wound. Some theorize that he refused to go along with this new medical advice because he had been embarrassed earlier in his career when he supported homeopathy, which is a pseudoscientific system of alternative medicine, which got him kicked out of the District of Columbia Medical Society. But having said all that, it still sounds unintentional, like it was caused by an inept egomaniac, not someone who murdered Garfield on purpose. I was only able to find a couple of things that could give this theory merit. One, in 1863, he got busted accepting a $500 bribe for using a certain inventor's stove in the hospital over better options, as well as being expelled from Washington, D.C. Medical Society for trying to sell Kundarango, which is the bark of a South American vine, which he claimed was a wonderful remedy for cancer, syphilis, scrofula, ulcer, and all other chronic blood diseases. Most absurd of all, he submitted a bill of $25,000 to the U.S. government for services rendered after Garfield died. He was then offered $6,500, to which he refused. Lastly, Candace Millard points out in her book, Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, that the wounded president caused a behind-the-scenes struggle for power. So what to make of this conspiracy? Of course, Dr. Bliss was an idiot, and most likely an egomaniac, and he wasn't exactly against taking a bribe or being a snake oil salesman. It is possible that in the power struggle behind the scenes, someone could have paid Bliss to kill the president, but this doesn't seem likely, as the president lived 80 days after the gunshot, amongst what amounts to torture by Bliss. If he was purposely trying to kill him, he could have done it much sooner. Plus, after Garfield's death, Bliss's reputation never recovered. The Patterson-Gimlin film, better known to the non-cryptid-minded people as that Sasquatch video, is basically the only Bigfoot video that has never been totally disproven. It is a legend in the cryptid community, and almost everyone has seen it. The story goes that Patterson and Gimlin were riding northeast along the bank of Bluff Creek between 1:15 and 1:40 p.m. They rounded an overturned tree and saw a log jam left over from a flood in 1964. They would then see a figure behind it in the distance. On the other side of the creek on the bank, the film then shows the creature walk off, and the rest is history. But this conspiracy theory disputes that version of events, and instead offers a different account, a much darker account. Supposedly, Patterson and Gimlin did not encounter the one and only female Sasquatch that day. According to the conspiracy, Gimlin and Patterson had spotted several Sasquatch, and their response was to immediately shoot and kill them. They would then go get a backhoe to use in burying the bodies. The main evidence for this theory comes from the video taken at the site afterwards. During the filming, a pool of liquid is caught in the camera's view. Most write this off as water, but proponents of this theory claim it's blood. There's also differing accounts to this story. There's one that says it wasn't just Gimlin and Patterson, but a party of 8 men. The film starts off with a few of the creatures digging for something. They are far away and start to walk down a trail to a pond. They separate, but then regroup. Then all of a sudden, a hail of gunfire opens up on the creatures, killing them cold. One dies immediately. The other runs off. The last one walks or staggers off. That is said to be the one from the Patterson-Gimlin film. But on this 50 seconds of film, there's supposed to be a scene where the men are dragging the lifeless bodies and placing them on a tarp, only to be cutting up the numerous Sasquatch to bury, I assume, as well as the film supposedly begins with footage of a dead Bigfoot in a freshly dug grave. The films were then allegedly taken and tucked away in a safety deposit box somewhere in Sonoma, California, and remain there to this day. The men supposedly only hid the video for fear of going to prison. The proof against this, outside the ridiculousness of it all, is that only one man has really pushed this theory, and that is M.K. Davis, and he doesn't have the greatest of reputations. He is an outcast, even in the cryptid world, and most completely dismiss him. At times, he's even claimed to have seen the footage, while other times, he's claimed to be in possession of it, but he's never produced anything to prove these claims. As for the so-called blood on the video, that can be explained in different ways. The video quality on cameras back then wasn't great anyways, so the sunlight could have caused the puddle to look red. Furthermore, there's plenty of natural causes in the woods that can give water a reddish tint. Finally, why would the Sasquatch just stand around watching the massacre before finally walking off? Was it just waiting for its few seconds of fame? This is supposed to be a creature that is fairly intelligent. The The premise for this conspiracy is just too stupid to take seriously. This black and white granny photo from 1894 sits at the center of our next conspiracy. According to the theory, this is the oldest known photograph of a Sasquatch in existence. The photo in itself is not of great quality. You can see here in the upper part of the photo where someone had photoed it at one point, and the white snowy background made it hard for this old camera to really pick up very many details. What you can see is something, maybe a Sasquatch, lying in the snow with its arms in front where the hairy hands can be seen. You can see a little bit of hair on the face, but not much. Hanging from the wrist looks to be like a cord or rope, something that probably had kept the creature tied up. I found varying sources on the size of the snowshoe, but the sizes ranged from 2.5 feet to 4 feet long, which will put the creature at around 3.5 to 5 feet long. Because of that, many claimed that this Bigfoot was a juvenile. But was this really a Sasquatch? And where did this picture come from? Well, the story goes like this. 2 trappers were out near a river in British Columbia where they encountered the Bigfoot and shot him. It's just possible that it was even shot close to the building and fence on the right-hand side of this photo, which could be the home of one of these trappers. But the creature in the photo is not the only interesting piece to this conspiracy. There is some writing on the back that we'll look at in a second. But first, we must take a look at getting the photo itself, because that ties into the conspiracy. Taking photos back then meant a professional photographer had to be involved. It was pretty expensive and not a common thing to do. It also wasn't very quick, and the photographer would have to carry around fairly heavy and quite expensive equipment to wherever he was going to be taking the photos at, which just adds to this mystery. That would be the first clue that this was not an ordinary animal. But let's get back to the writing on the reverse side of the photo. It states, year 1894, Yalakom River around Lillooet, BC, Forestry Hudson Bay Company. They took the picture, and the guy that was in the picture went and stole it back from the Forestry Records, Hudson Bay Company. I believe his last name was Holiday, don't know the first name. Never took all the pictures, only one, and took pictures of the rest. Glass plate photography. Now that's a bit to digest, but basically what it says is the photographer took more than one photo of this creature, and in some of the photos, a guy posed with the cryptid. That man's last name was Holiday. The Hudson Bay Company, who had hired the photographer to go to this remote location, which as I previously pointed out, is suspect in itself, would then take all the photos from the photographer and put them away. But this man Holiday was upset about it, and he went where they had stored them in the forestry records. It was here that he intended to steal the pictures back, but what he ended up doing instead was only stealing this one photo, presumably so he wouldn't tip them off. But then, he laid out all of the other photos on a table and took a picture of the rest of the photographs. The last part is key, because that means it was almost certainly the photographer who went to steal the photos, since he had taken a camera with him. And that also means he was the one posing with the creature. It is a weird addition to this story that just kinda makes the whole conspiracy that much more confusing, but it comes off like the photographer had taken extra photos to keep for himself, and the Hudson Bay Company just took them away from him, and he snuck back in to steal them, and chickened out and took the one and only granny photo we know of today. So what happened to the photo after this? That's where the story gets kinda hazy. It's believed that Holiday kept the photo to ensure that it was not destroyed or stolen by the Hudson Bay Company, and at some point, he passed it off to safe hands. Someone that would safeguard the secret, but no one's for sure really. He could have just as easily sold it to someone, but whoever that person was, then ended up writing the short story of how the photo came about. The photo after this was kept hidden until 1982, almost a full century after it was taken, when it would finally be made public in a book called The Bigfoot Casebook by Colin and Janet Board. Where the photo was in that time span and how many times it passed hands is unknown, but it may as well not have been published in the Bigfoot Casebook because it was quickly forgotten, even among cryptid researchers. It would resurface again in 2006 when it was posted to cryptomundo.com, and by 2018, it would make an appearance in the book Bigfoot Nation, The History of Sasquatch in North America by David Hatcher Childress. Now this was my attempt at a very brief summary of this case, so what to make of this one? At first, going into this, I was going to say I believed it, but the more I read into it, the less I believed it. For one thing, the photo quality is so bad. I mean, I know it's 1894, but there are other photos from 1894 online that show pretty good quality. Of course, it's been speculated that the photographer intentionally stole the worst photo, just in case the theft was discovered by the Hudson Bay Company. They possibly might not have pursued any action against him, knowing he took the weakest photo of the bunch. Which brings up the Hudson Bay Company part of this. What exactly would prompt them to cover up evidence of a Sasquatch? No one is for sure, but there's two general theories. One, once the men killed the creature, they realized it was more human than ape, which is a recurring theory among cryptid believers, and they panicked and covered it up. The second theory is that the Hudson Bay Company didn't want news of the discovery to spread because they feared the amount of people that might travel to the area to look for the creature could impact the trapping, and they dominated the fur trade and did not want to see that impacted. I guess the main reason I don't really believe it though is if you look at this photo closely, it kinda looks like a wildcat of some kind, or maybe even a bear cub. 1751 French military car. So I think it's safe to say that most people probably assume the first automobile ever made came around the early 1900s, largely because of the Ford Model T, which was the first automobile that was ever mass-produced using an assembly line. But of course, it wasn't the first overall vehicle. The first vehicle/car, in the sense that we know them, that was ever put in production started in 1886, when Carl Benz would create a gasoline-powered automobile, and then went on to produce several identical copies of it. Because of this, when I first glanced at this conspiracy, I thought there's no way it could be true. But when I started digging into it, I was sort of shocked to discover that the development of the automobile first started way back in 1672, allegedly. The story revolves around a Flemish man named Ferdinand Verbiest, who was a Jesuit missionary who visited China during the Qing dynasty. He was a very smart man, an accomplished mathematician and astronomer. He corrected the Chinese calendar and later rebuilt and re-equipped the Beijing Ancient Observatory, and in 1672, he is said to have started experimenting with steam, and designed a steam-propelled trolley sometime between 1679 and 1681. I say allegedly though, because the only source we have for this is Verbiest's own manuscript, in which he documents it. This manuscript would be brought back to Europe and reprinted in 1687. There are no other known sources that discuss the model, as well as no drawings of it exist, but if it is true, it would be the first ever steam-powered vehicle created, even though it was tiny and couldn't carry passengers. But this date range of 1679 to 1681 is important, and we'll come back to it. For now, let's jump ahead to 1770, when the next breakthrough happened. That was when the first steam-powered automobile capable of human transportation would be created, and it came by a man named Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, a French inventor. He would demonstrate his steam dray, which was a steam-driven artillery tractor that was designed to haul cannons. The military leaders of France would deem his design impractical and would not pursue further development on it. But it's here that we find another important date, that of 1770, because the conspiracy states that 19 years prior to this in 1751, someone in France, maybe even Nicolas himself, created similar vehicles to this, and that they were used in the French military conflicts and then somehow were lost to history, in spite of the fact that they provided a huge advantage for the French military at the time. And that's where the other important date range of 1679 to 1681 comes in. If that account is true, and the French learned of the vehicle in 1687 when the manuscript made it back to Europe, how likely is it that the French could have gotten a hold of the technology and expanded upon it over the next 50 years to develop a real military support vehicle? A vehicle so important that it gave the powerful French army an even bigger advantage. Furthermore, if it's true, why was Nicolas not given credit in 1770 for creating basically the same vehicle, instead of his being deemed too impractical to be of use? So I did a bit of researching on this one, and just like a lot of these other conspiracies, there's just not any real discussion about it. It seems like the basis for this conspiracy is again, the early steam-powered device created by Verbiest, if he really invented it. And then there's the fact that the conspiracy states that most of these French military vehicles were lost to history. It leaves us with a void to fill with our own belief, and so for me, I have to give this one a 2. mainly because we know that Nicolas Cugnot was working as an engineer for the French military as early as 1765, and I just don't see how from 1751 to 1765 that technology they used to build the vehicles could have been lost. There had to be someone around that could have kept building them, or at the least passed the knowledge on to Cugnot, but the fact that the invention failed to reach the battlefield can only mean that there was no such creation in 1751. Germany instigated the Spanish-American War. Another interesting one if you're a history dork like me. Most of you all know that the US and Spain had a war in the late 1800s, 1898 to be specific. Many of you know that it basically started after the sinking of the Maine. The war was short, lasting only 3 months, and saw a former great empire, Spain, taking on an up-and-coming nation, the US, and losing and seeing the death of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. The origin of this war really comes down to Cuba wanting independence from Spain, which in turn, the US supported because they wanted Spain out of the Caribbean. Spain had been putting down revolts for some time, with the US backing many of them. By the 1890s, American support for pushing Spain out became higher after reports of concentration camps set up in Cuba to control the population came out. Yellow journalism, or what we call fake news today, exaggerated many of the atrocities at these camps, just further making American citizens upset at Spain. And this part of the story you probably already know. The USS Armored Cruiser Maine would mysteriously explode in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. That explosion has always been a center of conspiracy. Most see it as US saboteurs blew their own ship up, and then with the help of the media, blamed Spain, before declaring war just a couple months later, or at the very least, taking advantage of an accident. But this conspiracy alleges that it was really Germany that was behind the USS Maine explosion, and then blamed it on Spain. But why would they do that? It turns out, there's actually some good reasoning behind this one, as Germany was late to the colonial period, and their overseas empire was tiny compared to the European powers like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal. By the time they stepped onto the scene, they were basically just buying up and annexing new lands in Oceania and Asia, but mainly, it was a ton of these little islands out in the Pacific that used to belong to, you got it, Spain. Because in the 1800s, Spain was quickly losing colonies. They were an empire that was just falling apart at the seams. Germany profited a lot from it too, and they, seeing the weak position Spain was in, tried to escalate tensions between them and the US even more, just so the rest of the empire would collapse, and they would be forced to sell the remaining land at a much cheaper price. This included the very lucrative Philippines. The theory further elaborates that if Germany wasn't responsible for the explosion, they were certainly guilty of stoking the flames and trying to provoke the US to declare war on Spain. They were doing this by using their media contacts to garner public support, while using their political contacts to lobby the government for war. And it's important to note here that as late as 1910, 554 German newspapers were still operating in the US, as well as a number of schools that taught German. And by that I mean 554 schools where English was a secondary language to German. The US had a huge German population that started with large waves of immigration in the 1600s, and before the World Wars, the US was a very pro-German country, so it's not crazy to believe that people in the German government had sympathetic contacts in the US waiting to help inflame the situation. There's other reasons to believe this though. A year before the war, Germany would seize the port of Tsingtao, becoming the last European power to secure a port in the Far East. The US, on the other hand, had no ports available in the Far East, and they had to rely on another country either letting them stay at their port or dispatching from the Pacific coast, which caused all kinds of logistic issues. But for this reason, control of the Philippines was something that the US desperately needed. Likewise, Germany also wanted the Philippines. Not only was it a prized possession, but it also kept the US out of the Far East. In fact, the first battle of the war happened at Manila Bay. The US Navy squashed the Spanish squadron fairly quickly, but as soon as the Spanish forces had lost the battle, numerous other warships from all the other naval powers showed up, all in a hurry to be in the best position just in case Spain collapsed and the Philippine revolutionaries threw the Spanish forces out. In fact, this is why Germany was one of the first to show up. They had plans that once Spain was tossed out, they could just move in and squash the rebellion and own the Philippines. They come under the guise of, quote, protecting German interest, end quote. But they immediately tried provoking the US by cutting in front of the ships, by refusing to allow the Americans to board for inspection, which is routine, since the US was besieging the islands, and only let them inspect after a warning shot had been fired, and then sneaking supplies into the besieged Spanish Philippines anyways, and again. This was in spite of the fact they were hoping Spain would get tossed out. They were playing both sides. The German military still believed at this point that America would be defeated pretty quickly, or at least in the Philippines, because of the aforementioned logistics issues. The US government would then tell Germany that in the event that Germany tried to seize the Philippines, the US would declare war. But at this time, Germany had way more firepower and manpower in the area and would have beaten the US Navy. Fortunately for the US, the Royal Navy was in the area as well and started sailing with the US and basically let Germany know they would side with the US in the event of a war. After this, Germany backed off on its plans to take the islands. After the war though, Spain did sell its remaining possessions in the Caroline Islands and Mariana Islands to Germany, just adding more proof to this theory. So what to give this one? Well, the explosion itself is still a center of controversy, as no one has ever been able to conclusively prove what caused it. But what happened afterwards? Well, that was the American government and media, who were just itching to remove Spain from the picture. But likewise, I think there's some merit to the fact that Germany was trying to remove Spain from the picture as well. For that, I'm going to go with a 4, because even though I believe the US was the main instigator, Germany definitely had a hand in it. Calvine Floating Island. On August 4th, 1990, 2 hikers near Calvine, Scotland would take a photograph of a mysterious diamond-shaped flying object hovering in the sky. This photo has went on to become what many have called the best UFO picture ever, leaving undeniable proof of alien visitation. And what only makes that stranger is the photo vanished for 32 years, leaving many people to speculate about what exactly happened. It was only recently rediscovered in 2022, thanks to the efforts of British journalist David Clarke, who put 13 years of research into finding the photo, and he finally found it with a former Royal Air Force press officer named Craig Lindsay, who had held on to a copy of the last remaining original print, just waiting for someone to inquire about it. The photo, which was really one of 6 in the series, shows a diamond-shaped object flying in the sky, while a fighter jet can be spotted in the background. When it was originally taken in 1990, the hikers took the photo to Scotland's Daily Record newspaper, but the paper instead handed the image over to the British Ministry of Defence, which had held on to it for those 32 years. The Ministry of Defence, after coming into possession of the photograph, would even pursue the negatives, which they also obtained. And as far as the negatives go, the Ministry of Defence claims they returned them back to the Daily Record, but the Daily Record claims they never received them. The 2 hikers remain unidentified as well, as they have hidden due to privacy concerns, and they will only be revealed in 2072. And despite all the press, these 2 have never voluntarily came forward, although one could surmise that maybe they just don't want to deal with the headache of UFO enthusiasts hounding them. But what we do know is these 2 men were chefs in a hotel who went for a hike one evening when they spotted the huge diamond-shaped object moving silently across the sky. They were able to snap off 6 photos before they got too scared and ran off into the woods and waited. It was then that they seen the jet start circling the object. Clarke, who rediscovered the photo, has since taken it to a senior lecturer in photography named Andrew Robinson, who said the image shows no signs of manipulation. Quote, "It follows that this is either a genuine unidentified flying object in the sky, or that any construction or manipulation used to create this effect occurred in front of the camera and not in the capturing of the scene on film, nor in the subsequent processing and printing of the image," end quote. Clarke, on the other hand, does not believe it is alien. Rather, he believes it was a top-secret project developed by the British military, maybe even the mythical Aurora, which was a top-secret reconnaissance aircraft that was rumored to have been worked on by the US in the 80s, which the US has consistently denied its existence. However, skeptics point out to one big flaw with this picture. They say that this legendary photo is nothing more than a rock in the water, and what you're really seeing is an optical illusion. If you look at this photo closer, you'll notice that the airplane looks like a reflection on the water. In fact, it looks like the bottom of the plane. And then there's the trees up above with the fence line below, which makes it look like someone took a perfectly timed picture of a rock in the water. And once you Photoshop some ripples into it, it seems fairly obvious. And as far as the fighter jet goes, in the 90s, there were a ton of these flying foam jet gliders advertised all over the UK. Lots of kids had them. It's just possible that it was purchased and hung from the tree to make it look like a real jet in the background. Secondly, there's the theory that the whole thing was just a complete duplicate of a UFO sighting from the 80s in Puerto Rico, where the man taking the photo came out and admitted it was a total hoax. And finally, the most interesting part in all this, the allegation that the Minister of Defense blocked the release of the photo. That's the key part to this whole conspiracy, and that is what has always given this credibility. But it turns out, the British Ministry of Defense did not block its release, at least according to a FOIA request. According to the British government, the only thing being kept classified is the names of the two individuals who took the photo, because they requested they be kept anonymous. But their names will be released to the public in 2072. As far as the photo goes, it's always been available. It's just no one ever asked to see it. Finally, there's a much more simple hoax theory here, which is that the picture doesn't involve a rock in the water at all, and that it's really taken in a field where the UFO is nothing more than a mountaintop, and the airplane is hanging down from a string. YouTuber Gary Bosolelli has even claimed to have found the exact spot of the photograph. When I first started reading over this one, I was going to give it a 5. I thought this was definitely the one case that was real, or possibly some kind of secret British technology. But the more I researched it, the more it seemed hoaxy, if that's a word. For that, I'm going to give it a 2. Although I will say, if we could see the other photos, I may change my mind. Voyages of Henry I Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Henry Sinclair was a Scottish and Norwegian nobleman who lived between 1345 and the early 1400s AD. It's said that he would acquire the position of the Lord High Admiral in 1358, working directly for the King of Scotland, but it's most likely that he earned that position a few years later. But what he's most famous for, and the reason he's on this iceberg, is because of a legend that says he took part in an exploration of North America 100 years before Columbus. Now the theory on this is a little convoluted, but I'll try to sum it up the best I can while keeping the important details intact. In 1558, a man named Niccolo Zeno the Younger would publish a map and a series of letters that described an exploration made by two brothers, the Zeno brothers, way back in 1390. Niccolo, of course, was a descendant of these two great men, and Niccolo claimed that he had just randomly found these items in the storeroom of his family home. And if that sounds sketchy to you, that's because it is sketchy. However, for some weird reason, this claim was widely accepted at the time. It was even put on maps by some of the best cartographers in the world. It wasn't until the modern era that historians started to widely dismiss this whole thing as a hoax, and an attempt by the Republic of Venice to make a land claim on the Americas. But in these documents was a weird letter that stated that the two brothers had made this voyage under the direction of an explorer/prince named Zichmany. He was supposedly the lord of some islands off the southern coast of Friesland, which may or may not have existed, but it was supposed to be larger than Ireland and located just south of Iceland. Anyways, Zichmany had rescued the two brothers after their ship ran aground, and when the three began to talk, they would plan to go on this expedition together, out past Greenland and into the west, and they supposedly discovered America. Now, if we jump 200 years into the future, in the late 1700s, a naturalist named Johann Forster, while researching the letters, would come up with a theory that the Prince Zichmany, who led the Zeno brothers across the North Atlantic to the Americas, was actually Henry Sinclair. And I have no idea how he reached that conclusion, but ever since he did, Sinclair has been bandied about by numerous authors that allege he was parading up and down the North American coast in the 1300s. The reasons vary, from simple things like the name Prince Zichmany was a misreading of the word Prince of Orkney, which is a bit of a stretch, to the carvings in Roslin Chapel, which was built by Henry's grandson in Scotland, The show's plants that proponents of the theory claim are New World plants such as corn or maize, which was unknown to Europe at the time, and it's used to prove that Henry Sinclair had indeed visited America before Columbus. Yet, skeptics say it's nothing more than depictions of wheat, strawberries, or lilies. Making this one even more confusing is the theory that Sinclair was a Knight Templar, and that the voyage either was sponsored by them or on behalf of them, even though the order was suppressed almost a half a century before Henry's life. Supposedly, the Knights Templar discovered, under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a royal archive dating from King Solomon's time. In that archive was the story of the Phoenicians who voyaged to the west continent following a star called Lamarica. Now that the Templars learned of this continent, they planned a route based on that star, and Sinclair followed it, supposedly in 1398. To add to this, some stories say him and his Freemason pals escaped with assorted treasures and the Holy Grail, and settled in Nova Scotia with the Micmac Indians. And although this story is kind of crazy, the Micmac tribe do have a traditional story about a king who long ago came over from an island far across the sea with many soldiers, and pretty much fit the same story told by the Zeno brothers. Oh, and that reminds me, it's probably a good time to point out that while Henry was there, he also built the Newport Tower. Sinclair is one of those stories where there was just too much added, and it should have just been left with the Zeno brothers story. With all the Templar stuff added in, it's just hard to take as legit. Almost every historian has claimed it's a hoax. Personally, I tend to agree with William Thompson's assessment in his 2001 book, The New History of Orkney. Quote, "It has been Earl Henry's singular fate to enjoy an ever-expanding posthumous reputation which has very little to do with anything he achieved in his lifetime." End quote. And that brings us to the end of this collection. Outside of the first clip, which was a members exclusive, all of the others were from the first year of the channel. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will be back soon with some new content. Goodbye and good night.